I live in Colorado, and when my family moved here, we were all so excited to be living in such a new place, close to everything we love. I was outside all the time with my friends, exploring our little town. More than anything, I loved hiking up in the mountains. It was beautiful and so wild up here. And one day, while I was out on a hike, I actually ran into this little coyote pup. He had been caught in his leg in a trap. He was nervous and wasn't able to get loose without any help. Tear things apart, but not like this. This seemed like it was done with human intention or force. This animal also appeared to have broken forelegs, as if something grabbed it, held it down, and tore its body open. It was unusual and very grisly. The other odd piece of it, too, was that the smell wasn't coming from this doe. In fact, even though this doe had appeared to be dead for a couple days now, was currently bloating, and there were some maggots about, it actually didn't really have much of a smell for whatever reason. And the campers, being about 40 yards away, should not have smelt it at all. Maybe the wind was picking it up. I wasn't sure. It just didn't make much sense to me. So, I disposed of this cadaver or whatever was left. That's when I got a call on my radio, saying that another camper on the other side of the park was also complaining of a very similar situation. An overpowering stench of rotting dead animal, and was convinced there was a bear around. I worked my way all the way to the other end of the park and spoke to this individual, a middle-aged man who was camping by himself, complaining about the same thing as the other family, a horrendous stench of death. Although this time, when I investigated, I went about as far as 100 yards outside of his camp into the forest. I couldn't find a trace of the smell, nor could I find the smell myself, or see any reason why there would be such a smell. I had asked him again, the last time he smelt it, how often had he been smelling it, and he said it would come and go, and only started smelling it in the past day. I did another thorough investigation by myself, but could not find anything. That was the end of that day. About 2 days go by, and I don't hear anything, any more complaints. The park is somewhat busy, which is even more of a surprise that I didn't get any complaints about that particular thing, which I guess is also a good thing. Hopefully, whatever it was had passed, although it's common to find dead animals, sometimes. It wasn't common the way they were dying or the way people were describing smelling them, but I guess I didn't think that much of it at the time, considering it was only 2 individuals that made a small complaint. This is where my story ties its ends. I very distinctly remember this day. I can remember it was pouring down rain, or at least throughout the day, we're having bouts of rain. And I got a complaint from an elderly lady and her husband who seemed to be long-term campers. She complained that she had heard some sort of screaming and smelt the awful same stench that had been described to me by previous campers. A scream, I wondered. After inquiring more about it, she described it as maybe a deer or something, possibly coyotes tearing apart a deer. She wasn't sure. This caused me to investigate further, and maybe I would get to the source of this weird thing going on. But to be able to smell that in the pouring rain and with all the humidity out, which means it had to have been strong. Now, this part of the camp I was at, or part of the park, the brush and forest were much thicker than other areas. Even more of a surprise that she could smell it, which would mean whatever the odor source was had to have been close by. I think I made it maybe 60 or 70 yards in before I finally found the source. After making my way through the brush, I saw what it was that was the source of the smell, and I stopped and had to cover my mouth for fear that I would scream or yell. What I saw in front of me was this large, what I thought was a man, pitch black from head to toe, and built very wide, large shoulders, no neck, and kind of a pointed cone head, barrel-like body, long gorilla-like hair, kind of like orangutan, where it's so long that it kind of hangs off you. Whatever this thing was that I was looking at, I caught it in the act. It had a doe in its hands, and right before my eyes, grabbed its head and twisted its head and neck completely off of its body, as if it was a mere piece of paper. The motion was completely effortless, and the deer, if being close to dead, was now dead, no questions asked. It did it so smoothly and so fluidly, I don't think that deer even had time to even blink. After the head was pulled off, there was of course lots of blood. This thing grabbed the deer by the back of the legs and threw it over its shoulder like a hunter would who had just killed a rabbit, and casually walked off. The smell of death and rotting meat followed with it due to the fear of not being believed, mocked, or potentially losing my job. I never said a word to anybody and kept it to myself. I ended up telling the elderly lady that the situation was taken care of and that it was just a dead deer eaten by coyotes, and we would have it taken care of for her. After that, I never saw anything like that again. So I don't know if this was a Sasquatch or what it was, but maybe it was coming through the area to hunt. That's just a guess. I don't know anything about them, but I guess that would make sense if they're anything like us humans. Thank you for taking the time to listen and read my story. Story 2. Watched from the Trees. I've told a few of my close mates about the same story, and I know they always come to the same conclusion. It was probably some unknown animal. But I've been in the woods a lot, and I'm not exactly sure what unknown animal would mean. But I guess that's really the only way to describe what I heard that day, because I certainly never saw what it was, but it made itself audibly known. This was somewhere between 2007 and 2008. I was working as a forest ranger at the time, doing service work on a closed-down trail, currently for maintenance. This would have been in the spring, and we were busy prepping it to open it back up to the public. There had been a landslide on several parts of the trail due to having such an incredibly wet fall and winter. You can't just allow the public to walk on these, you know. We have to make sure that things are deemed safe. It was roughly 2:30, maybe 3 p.m. in the afternoon. An overcast day. Not cold, but not warm by any means. Roughly around the end of March, and I don't know exactly at what point I picked up on it, but everything around me fell silent. Just the wind. There was an uneasiness about this silence. I know it's entirely possible for the forest to go quiet, but usually there's a reason for it. Sometimes it means there's a large predator in the area. Other times it could just be because animals aren't out. But there was just something about this. Like it wasn't that I just suddenly noticed it. My inner being felt it, if that makes sense to you. And it gave me this incredible uneasiness and made me pick up my pace even faster to get to my destination quicker. I wasn't exactly feeling great about the current circumstances. Although during this, I wasn't thinking anything about monsters in the woods or anything like that. I just did not want to be caught off guard, even if there was a predator, like a mountain lion or something like that. And I'll never forget this part. I got to a curve in the trail when I stopped dead in my tracks. Off to my right, where there's a thicker area of brush and trees, and to my left is a sharp rock wall. I heard a low, growling noise. It was a kind of growling, like if you continue to come forward, you're going to get attacked, or eaten, or worse. It made me stop, and I looked around, searching for a source of this noise, but I couldn't see anything. The foliage was just starting to grow back, but still very bare and minimal, considering spring had just barely started, and it wasn't at all like May or June, where everything is full and lush with leaves and brush. The noise was sounding like it was up in the trees, and not at ground level. But I figured that was impossible, because I was looking in the direction that I could have sworn I heard the growling coming from, and there was nothing. But it sounded as if it was coming from an animal merely 20 to 30 feet away from me, right off to my 3 o'clock. There was no way to describe it. And then it got deeper and louder and began to get closer to me, with still nothing to see. This made me incredibly fearful. There was no reason why I should not be able to see whatever it was growling at me. There was nothing terribly obstructing my field of vision or view. There was also really no object or tree that an animal of this capacity that can make this deep of growling could hide behind, at least without getting noticed. No, it was not a bear. There would have been nowhere for a bear to hide and continue to make that noise. Then, I heard a very similar growling noise from off to my left, behind me, to my 7 o'clock, where there was more brush and trees. I quickly turned around, and again, didn't see anything. Now, I had to keep watch of my left and my right, and I felt like I was in a pretty sticky situation. So I quickly put my back against the sharp rock ledge and slowly walked my way across the path, away from these sounds. This growling noise, which continued and continued, but never seemed to move, other than come closer to the spot that I was at on the trail. Maybe I was hallucinating. Maybe I was going crazy. But the farther I got away from that spot, it seems like the sounds of the forest began to come back. Even though very minimal, there were still sounds present. And now that I was far enough away, I was beginning to hear them again. I ended up talking to my supervisor and told him that weird stuff is going on the trail, and I would appreciate it if I could walk a different way back and have some help. I should mention this before I forget to, but at that time, my supervisor and the small team of other rangers that I worked with, we all knew that weird stuff went on. None of us were strangers to it, and although we didn't mention anything to the public or to anybody else, we all talked about it, so I felt very comfortable opening up to my supervisor and telling him what had happened. He completely understood. Anyway, I'm sorry if my story isn't all that exciting, but I'm pretty sure it was something other than a wolf or a bear, because neither of those animals make that kind of deep growling. I wish I could tell you what I suspect it was, but I never saw it. Maybe, in some crazy horror science fiction world, it was potentially camouflaged. I don't know. I'll never know. But what I do know is weird stuff like this has gone on in the woods for long, long periods of time, long before I ever became a ranger. If you or someone you know has a story or encounter they would like to share with me and read to my channel, please submit it to stories@whatlurksbeneath.com. You can find the email in the description below. I am a park ranger, and I am always being asked to tell people stories. Sometimes they want nature, and I could tell them about the time that I helped a mama moose have her babies. Sometimes they want funny, and I could give them a tale about the 2 naked grandparents who I discovered after they had discovered Viagra. And sometimes they want creepy, and I tell them this. Several years ago, I was just a random patrol of the park. I had been in the van, but had decided to head out on foot, just for the hell of it, on some animals and make sure everything looked peachy. I'd been wandering about for 10 minutes when I heard a noise. Being in the middle of a massive state park, 99% of which is forest, of course you're going to hear a plethora of noises from all the birds and creatures who live there, and just the trees living, branches falling, twigs snapping, totally normal sounds. What is not remotely normal, though, is to hear music, and more specifically, what sounded like ice cream truck music, playing that creepy clown music tune. Just to clarify, I was now in a part of the park, out of bounds to anybody but ranger personnel, and it would be near impossible to not only break in, to get an ice cream truck all the way out there without anybody seeing it. Of course, it could have been another ranger with the most odd ringtone ever, but I really didn't think so. I called out to see if somebody was there. Nothing. No response, but I could still hear that music. It sounded really tinny, like an old recording on a loop. Over and over. I must have spent the next hour just searching about, and the music just continued on and on. It seemed to be the loudest in a certain spot, but I just couldn't find the exact location. And then, it just stopped. I continued looking, but I never found anything that could have been making that noise. It has also never happened again, but it has really unnerved me. It was too loud to be some sort of device buried under the leaves, and it did not seem to be coming from the branches. Why on earth would anybody do that anyway? So I never solved that mystery. But this is the story I always tell people when they ask, because you don't always have to see something to be completely freaked out. I used to serve in the forest industry years back, and I have a pretty creepy story for you. There's this whole thing going on the internet about park rangers and finding staircases in the middle of nowhere. Well, I feel like that's a half-truth. Personally, and the people I knew who also served alongside with me, never found staircases. That is, staircases leading up. But me personally, the creepiest thing I ever found was a staircase leading down into the earth. This was not something that was easily visible, like you come out to a clearing in most of these fake stories, and there it is, just an old abandoned staircase sitting in the middle of nowhere. The one I found was tucked into some thick timber, quite a ways into the woods, upon just doing general exploration, and I found that this staircase led down deep into the earth. Out of curiosity, I went down a little bit, but I noticed it just kept going. Somebody, at some point, which I'm assuming long before this ever became a park, dug down deep into the earth. The steps to this were incredibly old. You could tell it was very old stone, covered in moss and wet, and it went down quite deep. I didn't have sufficient lighting at the time, so I only went down maybe 10 or 12 steps before deciding I should retreat back up. But I did get a bad feeling. It wasn't just me having anxiety, or me feeling nervous. I just had a genuine bad feeling about going down in there. I didn't try to yell or drop anything, nor could I shine light properly to see how far down the stairs really went. Who knows? But at the time I saw this, my mind instantly went to those park ranger stories that people talk about the staircases in the middle of nowhere. But since these ones actually went down into the earth, my first thought was that long ago, this possibly could have housed a bunker or some sort of old storage. Who knows? After all, it looks like it could have been here for quite a long time. I ignored it though for the most part, told my other friends and colleagues about it, and they also kind of gave me the same thing too. They were curious, but also had a bad feeling about it. The general consensus was don't go near them, and just kind of stay away from them. I don't think any of us really explored it. So to give you a more rational side of a very scary story, while the thought of it is spooky, I think there is a very rational explanation that these could have led to maybe a bunker or something. Who knows? With how old the stones looked, my guess is that it would predate the 1900s. But I can't imagine why anybody would build something that deep under the ground in the 1800s. The park I work in, unfortunately, now need security as well as rangers. You see, around 50 years ago, there was a real nasty murder-suicide on the site. Supposedly, the guy involved who stabbed his wife before shooting himself was big into Satan and black magic. So, every so often, we get people out there either trying something themselves or just to say they've been here. It gets real old, especially when we're trying to do our job, looking after the park and keeping everything up. It was Bambi season when I found something really strange. Lots of baby deer being born, so we were on high alert for anyone trying to sneak past. We didn't want any more blood on our hands, plus we had a lot of small babies to look out for. So when I was wandering back through the woods and noting which deer were still pregnant, when I saw the small tent pitched on the floor, I was more mad than worried. How had anybody snuck down here undetected? I walked over to it and was about to march them right out of there or call the cops, when I saw the tent looked like it was ripped on one side. It had 3 long slashes. It looked and appeared to be sharp claws had ripped clean through the material. I called out, but no answer. I pulled out my gun just in case, kicked at the tent. No movement, so I carefully undid it just in case. Inside was just one thing, a teddy bear, nothing else. So there was a tiny tent with a giant knife or claw-like rips through it, and one small teddy bear inside. There were no prints around it either. No footprints other than my own. No tire tracks, nothing. It was as though somebody had just dropped a tent down onto the ground and left it. It appeared to be a good quality tent too, and even the teddy bear looked to be expensive. Having reported it, I put them on the truck and took them back to the office. The bear still had a tag on it, so I googled the name of the store. It was in the UK, and sure enough, when I looked closer, the price was in pounds like they use over there. So that added even more to the mystery. An expensive bear from another country. A real good quality ruined tent. Abandoned with no prints in the middle of a national park, here in the United States. And when I double-checked through the visitor books, the reports of anybody who had been in and out of the park in the last few days, it was completely empty. There hadn't been anybody except for rangers for a week. We've never been able to come up with a reasonable explanation for this. It's very strange. I'll straight up tell you, the most bizarre thing to ever happen as my time as a park ranger was finding missing persons under crazy lapses of time. A perfect example was a young man who had just turned 21 who disappeared on June 1st, reappeared on the end of July, not having known any time had passed. When found, his clothes and everything was in perfect condition, just as the same as the day he had went missing. Turns out to him, only a few hours had passed, but we had told him that nearly 2 months had gone by, and his entire friends and family thought of him dead and missing permanently. When interviewed by police and us, he claimed he had no idea how much time had gone by, and how that much time had even gone by. How was this even possible? The young man had zero recollection of that much time passing without ever knowing, and his clothes and the condition he was found in appeared to be the exact same as the day he was found missing. We're not exactly sure what to make of it, but this is not the first time it happened. An elderly lady was found in the near same condition, nearly 6 months later after her supposed missing. When she was found, it was the exact same scenario as the young man, only she had disappeared around 2 years later and then found 6 months afterwards. And the most disturbing by far was an infant around 16 to 17 months old, just barely walking and toddling around, went missing for an entire 3 months, and was found in the exact same spot she went missing. The most bizarre thing is that her clothes appeared the exact same with the last 2 individuals. No markings, nothing wrong. Perfectly clean just as the way they were the day she went missing. She also, and hear me out, this is very disturbing, she also appeared to not even realize she was gone, and had not even grown or aged in the slightest. Not that you would necessarily notice an age difference between a 16-month-old and a 19-month-old, but her hair, nothing had grown. It was literally as if she had been frozen in time, just as the last two. While I'm not exactly sure how to explain these disappearances and sudden reappearances, some of my friends speculate could very well be alien abductions. That's the only thing that could explain the extreme passing of time with no physical or mental changes. But me, I'm more on the skeptical side. I don't believe in aliens or UFOs, but I certainly cannot explain this strange phenomenon that has happened. With 2020 being one of the most toxic years of my life, luckily, I've been out of the job field for quite some time. But back the year prior, when I was working full-time as a ranger, I've had my fair share of some crazy stories that you probably wouldn't believe. One was that people were claiming to see a large pack of wolves roaming in and all throughout the area. Only problem is, there's no wolves in this entire state, and the pack that people were claiming to see was abnormally large, larger than any wolf pack would ever travel in. Probably around 19 to 20 wolves in total. Very, very large wolves that would come and go as they please. Sometimes they would show up in certain areas, and in another unrealistic time frame, show up in an adjacent spot not too far away. The things just weren't exactly adding up. Other people even claimed to see them as translucent or opulent. This would happen in strange spans of time. All of a sudden, people seeing these large packs come and go, and then for months, nothing. And then, these packs of wolves would come and go again. There was no real decipherable pattern. There was no rhythm to it. It was as if it was completely random. On top of that, people would go missing, and then 2 weeks later, all of a sudden show up as if they had never disappeared, having zero memory or anything of them ever being gone. The creepy thing was, they had no idea that time had even passed since their disappearance, nor did they even know that they were even taken or disappeared in the first place. Many of them would even get the dates wrong when asked about what time it was, or what day it was, or even the month. Just stuff like that. Things I can't quite come to a conclusion myself, because I honestly don't have a rational explanation. I've heard other stories from fellow rangers about them finding wild indigenous people, and I'm not talking like tribes of New Guinea. I'm talking like large humanoid people, covered in hair. And before you go the route of Bigfoot or Sasquatch, know that I don't think it's very possible. Not in these areas of woods. Except these were tribesmen, wild people. There was even a segment of time, I want to say around 5 weeks, where the entire park was shut down for an indefinite amount of time. A choice made by our higher-ups, because apparently, about 4 or 5 people disappeared simultaneously, all around the same patch of a few days. They were never found, nor any article of clothing or any trace of them was ever discovered. And believe me, we searched high and low. I was well a part of that search expedition, and we found nothing. I've heard of other search expeditions where nothing came up, but this was my own personal expedition where I found no trace of them, which is highly unusual. Having been a part of many, there's usually always at least something that you find. Clothing, a body, remains, something. But I just can't imagine 4 to 5 people, an entire group, missing at the same time, as if they had just disappeared off the face of the planet. Things like that will keep you up at night, and make virtually zero sense as to what happened. I still dream about it sometimes, wondering where they could have gone, how they could have gotten away when they did, and where are they, if ever are they going to come back. Then, you think of the obvious. They obviously died of exposure, or perhaps found a cave somewhere and hid down in it. But when your own search dogs can't even get a scent, or they find the scent and it just abruptly ends, and then your dogs start acting weird. There's just something up. Something I don't like, and I'm not exactly quite sure what it is or what it could be. In my opinion, hands down the scariest thing I've ever heard of or seen is apparently a grizzly bear being found dead, ripped in half from the waist down, or the waist up, whichever way you prefer it. Kind of like a glass of water half empty, half full kind of deal. Something, which I don't know what does this in the wild, would not only attack a grizzly bear, but have the sheer strength to rip it in half. Not cutting, not using a tool, not sawing, none of that. Sheerly ripping this creature in half. That alone is enough to make you want to quit your job. And this grizzly bear wasn't a juvenile or an adolescent or a young pup. We're talking a fully grown adult male grizzly bear. When this bear's body was discovered, it was near a river and was freshly killed, most likely within the last 48 hours of finding it. Decay and rot had already started to set in, but it's still a very disturbing find, even for the experienced ranger. It's stories like that, along with the others that I've shared with you, that make me honestly want to stay out of this career field. And since COVID, I've not been involved. And to be honest with you, when things supposedly start back up, I think I'm going to pursue a different line of work. This just isn't keeping its flair like it used to for me. Many years ago, I had the fortunate experience as working on a ranger for 7 years at the Mammoth Cave National Park. It's also the country's largest cave system, and having generated tons of paranormal reportings, it's not surprising when you get a call that there might be screaming or somebody submerged deep in the caverns. After all, there is well more than 400 miles worth of tunnels and passages, all deep into the earth. There have also been other reports of rangers going in there after people, supposedly screaming and dying themselves, never to be seen again. I've heard of rangers even going into some of these cave systems to go after people for expeditions, and never being seen again, while some report back being chased by a large unidentified predator or animal. Others have even reported seeing ghastly figures, red glowing eyes, or felt ominous, terrifying feelings, being watched, being stalked, or the worst one yet, being hunted. And unfortunately, the calls do not stop coming in. I can't tell you on a personal account how many radio calls I'd received about supposed missing persons coming from the cavern systems, or that other rangers would be by, and people and campers would be complaining about screaming coming from the cave systems, as if somebody was stuck in there and couldn't find their way out. Well, you bet it's our job to go investigate, to make sure nobody's hurt. After all, there have been legitimate cases of people getting lost and trapped in there, and we've had legitimate cases where we've actually had to go and rescue them. On the contrary, though, there are those cases where we do receive calls, and we go, and there's no trace of anybody, nor sign of where the apparent screaming or noise was heard. Only ominous, evil feelings. And this isn't just you creeping yourself out or getting spooked because you're in a dark cave. I'm talking almost an electrical feeling in the air, a feeling in the pit of your stomach that tells you you are in innate danger and that you need to leave, or that something is watching you, observing you the way a cat observes a mouse right before it's about to pounce. This danger that makes the hair on the back of your neck and your forearms stand straight up. I've even talked to some of my other fellow colleagues. None of us enjoy those calls, but as the job entails, we must answer the call of duty when called. Some of the older rangers of the area truly believe there are large species of unknown animals living down in the subterranean tunnels. Me, I can't exactly say that I believe, although I've felt the presence. I felt the ominous feelings, but I've not seen anything. Some of the older, more retired rangers have talked about seeing these beings, and that they go and traverse throughout the tunnels and go in and out of the cave systems into the forests at nighttime. They describe them
all which way, from hideous reptilian-like beings to large, hairy humanoid ape creatures and everything in between. With how crazy everything is in the world right now, I guess I wouldn't put it past reality to pull that kind of trump card, no pun intended. And while the cave system has active tours and is deemed supposedly safe on many accounts, as a ranger and as somebody that works around it often, I would never step foot in there on my recreational free time. I've just dealt with it too much. It's not something I'm particularly interested in, and as a professional and friendly warning, I suggest you don't either. I just can't deem it safe. There's already been 2 missing person reports in the last year, just from that cave alone, and even more from the years prior, all following the same pattern. They disappear, no trace. When the expeditions start up, their scent is led to these cavern entrances, where the dogs won't go in any further, which I've never seen that in a search and rescue dog before, where they utterly refuse to go in any further, no matter what the circumstance or environment. It's almost as either they feel danger themselves, or the scent trail stops, and they refuse to go in any further. Something is up, and although many of us know, I feel like we're not allowed to talk about it. So, thank you so much for being a way that I can vent my struggles and stresses, and then I can actually type all this out and send it in. You wouldn't believe how many of us all feel the same way. We all see and know the same things, but due to our job, legalities, and other things, we can't say anything. We're not allowed to. But as a person to person, I would like to give you an extended warning that these parks, these national park systems, aren't all what they're cracked up to be. They're not so safe and pretty like they're painted to be. There's more things and people going missing than you could ever imagine. You wouldn't believe how much of it is kept hush-hush. And I feel there's a good reason for that. Park reputation. If the general public knew half the things that went on, or half of the missing persons that happened, well, you would probably be willing to spend a lot less money into the parks and recreation system. It's just common sense. So, if you keep the public in the dark about this, it's much easier to keep revenue flowing, and systems and structures can be maintained more easily and kept in place. After all, money is what makes the world go round, and this is no different. I hope these sets of stories find you well, and I hope you take caution. If you enjoy going into these cave systems, just be extremely careful, and always bring protective gear, plenty of lights, and never, never forget a weapon.
I've been in search and rescue now for quite some time, and I've seen some pretty strange things in the parks that I work in. But one of my most memorable moments happened when I was called to search for a missing child. It was a sweltering summer day, about 5 years ago now, when we all got a call out to look for an older man who had wandered off the marked trail in one of our local parks during his morning walk. It isn't uncommon to get calls like this, so I wasn't surprised when the dispatch said that the subject was alone. What made this case different is that he was reported to be in his 80s. It's my policy to tell dispatch to hold off on sending us in if search times will go over 3 hours due to how many people are available for a search operation at any given time. But it seems they already had several crews out looking for this guy, and none of them were having any luck finding him. It didn't take long for me and my partner to find him, but when we did, my heart sank into my stomach when I saw the condition he was in. He was disheveled, collapsed on the ground with his hand digging in the dirt and leaves. He was murmuring to himself about something. I knew something wasn't right when I saw him. I couldn't make out what he was saying at first. His voice was muffled by the thick bag over his head. But soon enough, my partner tugged it off of him. Once we saw what he had done to himself, things finally clicked. He'd strung climbing rope through the eyelet on a sturdy-looking military surplus backpack, then cinched it tightly around his neck before knotting it under his jaw. We could see that there were 3 thick prongs that ran along the length of the rope where it met with each knot. So not only would this have strangled him, it would have also ripped through his neck as he thrashed around. Once we got the poor guy down and untied, I took a good look at what was inside of this backpack. Loaded with survival gear, heavy-duty flashlights, and other rations. But those weren't what concerned me. Inside one of the pockets were 4 pencils and a notepad full of scribbled words that did not make any sense. They seemed to be lists mixed with strange symbols and random letters. The rest of the pages were covered in jagged drawings, disturbing images depicting people writhing in pain or shame, people being cut apart by these chaotic beasts, and worst of all, pictures of animals, highly depicted with their throats being torn out. After we got the man safely into the ambulance, my partner and I searched through our database to see if anything matched up with what he had written. We couldn't find a single thing that made sense. So, we sent it off to a friend of mine at a nearby university for further analysis. About 30 days later, I get an unexpected call from him that left me feeling cold all over. Apparently, the scrawling was written in some sort of code, one that he claims is older than dirt, but still manages to stay as fresh as morning dew, if you can understand his hippie gibberish. He said he'd be happy to translate it for us, and would cover his expenses. He told me that most of the scribblings were lists of names, actually, but when he translated them, they came out to be Latin. He said the language used was a dead language, and was initially used worldwide, more so for ancient spells and curses, to medical journals or government documents. One name in particular stood out, Vulgarius Legionis. It meant something like Scourge of the Vulgar, and is apparently responsible for some pretty nasty stuff. That part creeped me out the most, the symbols buried between the lines. I don't know who invented these things or what they mean, and my friend called them sigils, but he says each one holds immense power over their respective domains whenever they are activated correctly. Forgive me, for my knowledge of black magic and things of that realm are very minimal. I can't be certain, but I think what got him was the weird, drawn-over-top thing almost every single image. He told me that he would keep asking around about other signs that resembled this one, and also try to find out more information about the mysterious Vulgarius Legionis. If you hear anything about this, please let me know, so I could pass it along as soon as possible. A few years back, I used to work at Fort Baker in California's Golden Gate National Recreation Area. One of my patrols was the abandoned missile site, SF-88L, near Hawk Hill. The missiles were taken out and scrapped in 1974, and once they left, all that was left was a foundation and some rusty wire mesh through the middle of the site. So, we would often patrol it, and make sure there wasn't any graffiti or anything like that going on. You know how young punks can be. Most people don't think about an old missile base being haunted, but this place had a weird feeling of foreboding when you went inside of it. It just felt creepy. Past midnight, it definitely offered some weird vibes. There was a door which had no handle, but you could open it by pushing on the upper left corner for long as it took. This led to a small room with a chair, and lots of bird feces everywhere. Then, there was yet another heavy-duty door that led to the control room. One night, we decided to patrol here. My partner and I were told not to go inside due to liability reasons. So, we stayed outside until roughly 2 a.m., when nothing interesting had happened. I went back there on patrol a few months later, and one of my fellow rangers told me that after dark, if you were all alone in the control room, you could hear footsteps coming from behind you. like somebody was walking around. And not disembodied footsteps either, but like somebody wearing big, clanky, heavy boots. It has only happened sometimes though, but obviously no one has worked there for a long time. And now, and if they go inside by themselves, they're obviously too freaked out. You would need at least 2 people to have somebody stand outside the door. And they're not joking either. I've been in there myself. It's very creepy. I don't know if it has anything to do with the footsteps, but when you're sitting inside on one of the benches, while looking straight ahead, you can see a small portion of that room behind the left wall of the control panel. And every time you look back up, something is staring at you from that spot on the wall, out of what appears to be nowhere. The year was 1991. I was a young, spry, and full-of-life park ranger. My partner and I were dispatched to a remote section of the park. The call was for a missing hiker, or so we thought. After driving, and I can't remember how long it took, we finally got to the area dispatch said the hiker was last seen in. It looked like an average day in the woods, if not for the fact it was raining pretty heavily. The trees themselves weren't moving at all, but the lack of wind and rain definitely was not helping things. We began searching, and what appeared to be a normal trail, when something caught me off guard that would change my life forever. Footsteps behind me. I turned around quickly, ready for anything that might have been there to see nothing there again. My partner again heard it. We both looked around us to see who or what could be stalking us. The footsteps would continue behind us every so often, always just out of sight, yet they appeared to be getting closer and closer each time. Soon enough, my partner and I decided we should return back to the truck. For safety giving, nothing was showing up. We headed back down the trail and took a different path to get to the parking lot where our truck was initially parked at. We did not stop moving until we got inside and locking both doors. After leaving, we both began discussing what might have been following us that day, but came up short on figuring out anything other than it couldn't have been another person due to the remoteness of the area. And if it had been a person, they would have been soaked from the rain, no shelter. Whatever it was continued following me for the rest of that year, until one day, I decided to take my service revolver out with me on this particular path. I never had an issue with that again, so I guess I got lucky that time around. Was I having some sort of ghost following me? I don't know. It's sure interesting. I live in Florida, and we have a vast array of different things to do here. You've got your typical Disney World type places, beaches, and then you have the Everglades. The Everglades are a large swamp filled with animals that most people fear, like alligators and snakes. Ever since I was a young child, my parents would take me on trips to the Everglades so I could see what it was like, up close and personal. A few years ago, I turned 18 and my family decided to go camping for a couple of days in the middle of the Everglades, just so we can get away from everything and relax. My brother brought his girlfriend along with us, which made things even more interesting. The first day we were there, my family and I took a canoe out into the middle of this one lake. We had been going at it for about an hour when we saw a cabin sitting on a clearing beside the lake. My brother's girlfriend wanted to get a closer look. She said that it would be interesting to see what somebody was doing all the way out in the middle of nowhere. My dad, being one to never pass up an opportunity for adventure, agreed with us to check it out. And a side note, yes, I'm well aware I'm crazy for being out on a lake in Florida. We did know the risk of alligators being in all the water. We weren't scared. In hindsight, this was probably incredibly stupid and dangerous. So my family parked our large canoe off to the side of this cabin and got off, so we could get a better look at it from ground level. When we got next to it, nobody seemed to be home, and there was this creepy feeling that somebody was watching us. The cabin was much older up close, and it looked like it had actually been abandoned for quite some time. But there were no signs of dilapidation, so we figured possibly people still came out to the cabin from time to time. We knocked on the door, waited, but there was no answer. We decided to take it upon ourselves to look inside. When we opened the door, it creaked loudly. How cliché. My brother's girlfriend was a little spooked. Nothing seemed strange about the inside of the cabin, other than this very weird painting in the back. Afterwards, we searched through the cabinets and other things around the room, but after about an hour or so, it was pretty much rifled through. Things were kind of destroyed and there wasn't much else here, so we headed back outside. It definitely was a cool little cabin, or at least used to be. Once we got back on the ground, my brother's girlfriend told us that she had seen this man in what she described as a black ranger outfit, standing behind some trees over there when they first arrived. She said he just stood there watching them, didn't say or do anything. When I asked her if it could have been an actual park ranger, she said that they weren't wearing a traditional uniform, didn't have any of the equipment with them either, all of which is very strange, since usually they kind of resemble cops. You know, they carry guns and radios. As we're sitting out there by the lake talking, we could all of a sudden hear something. The sound of snapping twigs and labored breathing. At one point, we really started looking around, and my brother said he saw a man like the one his girlfriend described, standing just outside beyond the cabin. Only this time, he can hear him mumbling about things. When he looked up at him, he said that he was kind of covered in black, or so that's how he described it. Like he was a solid black shape, and not so much having features like a person. It was terrifying for him. We got back in the canoe and rode all the way back to where we originally started, going back to our car. All the doors had been open, even though the car was clearly locked. My brother's girlfriend insists that it was the ranger guy, and insists on calling him the ranger thing, because she doesn't want anything to happen to her. I think this story should be kept alive, just so people can know that there are creepy things out there in the wild too, not just at campgrounds or other well-developed areas. I wouldn't doubt that a lot of people have seen something similar, followed suit with park regulations due to their fear of being reprimanded for talking about it. As far as our ghastly apparition, I don't know. Could this have possibly been the cabin of an expired park ranger who died? Either way, it creeps me out to think about. I worked in the Forest Service industry for a few years in my youth. I loved it, and still do love the outdoors. It's a good place to be. Lots of adventure and also a lot of danger. One time in particular, though, I came across a very strange experience with inexplicable circumstances. It has haunted me ever since. Feeling disheartened after another day of fruitless searching for lost hikers or hunters, I was making my way back from the foothills, and I encountered something extremely out of place in such an isolated region. In all technicality, it should have been impossible to find anything there at all if you look away from the roads, towards the mountainside. This thing, however, had somehow appeared just beyond our initial sight, in a clearing we were using as our base of operations. At the time, we didn't know what it was, and all of us were creeped out by it. When I say it, I mean a very tall, athletic man figure, appearing to be dressed in full camouflage, standing completely still with his arms at his sides, staring off into the woods, as if he were looking directly at us. Here's what's creepy. His skin was dark gray, almost black, and kind of shiny, pokey looking, like an exoskeleton or something. And his eyes glowed in orange, the same way hazard lights do. He stood perfectly still and straight, appeared to be very intimidating, despite lacking any physical weapons, not even a knife or anything of any kind. My boss thought it was somebody twacked out on drugs, running over to him, Our team leader asked the man what he was doing there, where he was from. This man or figure did not answer. Instead, just continued staring out blankly. He never looked back, though, and after a few more seconds, it kind of just evaporated in the air. This scared all of us, and our boss decided to run, call for backup. Our team leader called the police after reaching the base ops on his radio. By then, of course, it had gotten dark, and we could see this silhouette in the distance, following us, what we thought was this man or person. I don't know if this was some sort of ghost, or a demon, or a paranormal entity, or what. Everybody else now who's been involved has either left or retired by now. I don't think anybody knows what happened, except maybe one of us. I know, this sounds like a really bad horror movie or something, but there's no doubt in my mind this man was real, and very dangerous if provoked. This creepy tale is 100% true, and I'm not going to make something up about this, or bears, for example. You know, after seeing everything I have, this sighting still stays with me. It's disturbed me ever since. I don't know why, but I feel it's important to share. I was patrolling the Appalachian Trail at New Jersey's Worthington State Forest, looking for a couple of campers who had been reportedly lost. This time, however, instead of finding someone trying unsuccessfully to find their way back down the mountain after dark, I found two young women huddled by a smoldering fire pit under an overturned log, wearing little more than just bare clothes, even though it was 40 degrees outside. When I approached them with my mag light, they screamed so loudly that all I could do was shine it on their faces while hurriedly telling them not to be afraid. They were hugging each other tightly, and I could see why they were visibly shaking. When I asked them what was wrong, one of the girls said something had been stalking them since sundown, and they had gotten lost and locked themselves down in this spot. And that's when she said she saw its eyes in the woods. After calming her down enough to understand what she was saying, I shone my light into the woods behind them, where they'd last seen whatever it was. I saw nothing but bushes and trees, although there was a quick rustling in some nearby leaves, so slight that I would not have heard it without all the absolute silence around us. Even the crickets were now silent. I could feel goosebumps rising up on my arms, even though it really wasn't that cold. The girl who'd spoken pointed deeper into the woods in that direction and whispered, "It's back there. Why don't you go see?" I was about to tell her it must just be a deer or a bear, but then we both heard the same noise again, only this time much closer. I shone my light in that direction, and as I'd feared, saw nothing but trees, which means whatever it was hiding. Curiously enough, though, the branches started shaking as something was coming through them, toward us very quickly. The girl who'd been talking pointed frantically at what she saw and screamed. Something emerged from behind the trees. It reminded me of a failed science experiment. It was reminiscent of a bear, but also like that of a person, with a very deep set-in face, sunken eyes and skin that looked very unnatural, like it had been peeled off and sewn back on. It moved towards us fast, cautiously, kind of sniffing the air, curiously approaching. I just told the girls to get up and run. I drew my handgun, but when I turned to look at them, to yell to run again, they were both crawling over each other, trying to run. This creature stopped immediately. They became silent, refusing to leave while staring at me. I told them to get going again. They wouldn't move. The girl then screamed, "Shoot it! Shoot it!" Then, this creature kind of scoffed, turned around and disappeared into the darkness, snarling and making all sorts of nasty growls as it left. The girls finally calmed down after that, asking me what it was. but I had no idea. I told them we should head back to our campsite. Even though they were half dressed, at least there'd be people around us to help if that thing came back. I walked them back to their campsite. Didn't see any sign of anybody else being there. I told them if they'd be okay if they huddled together by the fire and wait for me for a while I tried to go look for their friends or family, since they weren't responding, and I assumed by the amount of tents that were at their site, they were certainly not alone. They were still visibly shaking as I left. Something happened to them out there. I assumed they were with another group of hikers, probably their family. They must have got separated, turned around, lost, and then this thing chased them. I immediately contacted authorities, let them know what I'd found and not mentioning a word about the animal I'd seen. I informed them that I believed they were nearly attacked by a large bear. I never did find any evidence of their family or party that they had come with. There are still things about that night that still don't make sense to me, as somebody who's seen a lot of strange things. Things that really defy the imagination. The scariest moment of my life was when I was a ranger and had to go into the woods one evening. That seemed much different than usual. The light from my flashlight swept across the tree line as I walked into the darkened forest. The sound of rustling leaves and breaking twigs would echo all throughout the eerie silence, as if every living thing were fleeing the area. I looked around at everything I could, whilst waiting for something to come out of the dark towards me, but nothing did. All of a sudden, off in the distance, I heard what seemed like footsteps behind me. Just then, one more shine of my flashlight revealed yet another ranger standing there. I opened my mouth but was frozen with fear when it spoke first. This ranger, who I'd never seen before, possibly a colleague, began to shapeshift in front of my eyes, having this almost deep, raspy voice saying, "You can't escape," but not out of its mouth. It was more telepathic. All I could do was let out an almighty scream, running faster than I'd ever done so in my life. I could hear the sound of it or him chasing after me, but I would stop and look back, and nothing was there. When I left the forest, 2 other rangers, my colleagues, were waiting by my side, trying to calm me down, ask what had happened. And they said that they hadn't seen anybody in the forest with me, or seen anybody with any flashlights at all. They also told me that there had been no other rangers in there. They just waited and waited. Waited for me to go on to more detail, but I never could. I still cringe every time I think about it. I was put on medical leave for a while. They thought I was schizophrenic, having hallucinations. It turns out I cleared those tests, and come to find out some time later, other rangers had been reporting similar events to what I had in that same area of the park during the evening on the same count of an investigation. Strange noises. Of course, the plot thickens. Get this. Going back to the early 1900s, there used to be a huge Indian burial site right around here and was later demolished and destroyed in some way. I'm not too sure how or why. I believe it was partly due to expansion and development. I'm not 100% sure. Just digging up a bit of the history around the park and the area. Of course, at the time, I didn't know this. I was never really a believer in ghosts and things until this knowledge came to me, and I paired it with my previous experience that night. I began to hear more and more rangers come forward, talk about seeing strange apparitions in that same portion of the park, along with strange unexplainable noises and shapes. This has terrified many of us, and much afterwards, many of us refused to go anywhere near that patch of trees or respond to calls of screams from that same area. I'll first start by saying that this is my actual experience, not a story told to me. I don't normally explore the woods at night during the summer because, well, it gets dark around 10 p.m. The fact that I was out there late, on a hot Friday night, only means something must have compelled me to do so. Anyway, this happened around 10:30. The temperature, of course, began to drop as soon as night came up, but until then, it was just one of those very warm August nights where you could practically sleep outside comfortably with just sheets and no pillow if you really wanted to. I was listening to music, laying on my back, looking straight up, just watching the night, thinking about my life, when suddenly, I see something move in the corner of my eye. I look over, and to my shock and amazement, there is this shape about 5 feet away from me. It was on all fours at first, but then it stood up like a man. However, when I say man, what I mean is that it looked like a human, but had no hair anywhere on its body, which caught me off guard considering how unnatural this was. Also, there was no distinguishing features such as nose or ears, just a smooth surface where they should have been. Its head was bald and black, and its surface seemed smooth. I immediately felt tremendous fear upon seeing this, not just because it was the unknown, but because it was something I never dealt with in my life before. I don't know how long I was staring at it, but eventually, it turned around and walked off into the forest. I stayed there for a few minutes, trying to figure out what just happened, looking for some kind of logical explanation, although I know that one would elude me. Maybe somebody was playing a prank on me, but there was no way this could have been a person in any way, shape, or form. I got up and ran home as soon as I could, sitting on my porch for a couple of hours, trying to calm down, sneaking a cigarette, trying to process what had just taken place. Now, it wasn't until I started to write this out did things really start to sink in from memory. As soon as I got home and sat down on my porch, I heard something moving very quickly through the forest, still heading deeper in the woods. It sounded large, like just one singular animal, but I could tell that it was running fast on its feet, and it was nearly silent, because the ground it was on was wet and mossy. I know there are animals out there which could account for what I saw. However, up until now, that I've really thought about it, none of them seem to fit the description of what I saw. Nothing makes sense. I've tried to play it off so many times before, but nothing makes sense anymore. I've been scared for my life ever since this night. I feel like I'm being watched sometimes when I go outside. I can always feel something around me, even when it's bright daylight out. I've never encountered anything like this before, and I don't know what to do anymore. I didn't know who else to contact or what I should do. So I decided to share this with all of you guys who might know what it is. I'm a paranormal researcher and psychic medium. I've been studying cryptozoology for some time now. As a medium, I'm very sensitive to the paranormal and all the energies that are around us. I have had many experiences like this one, until I began putting names to them. So on this day in question, I was having a normal day running errands, and I decided I would go kayaking on the lake to just kind of relax and enjoy the warmth of summer. So, being in eastern Vancouver, British Columbia, I thought it would be fun to kayak and set out for one of our islands around here. As I was going around, coming to my final island before turning back, I felt uneasy about something. I stopped paddling and just sat there for a moment. The water was quite calm, no wind, the sky was clear with plenty of sunshine. And then, out of nowhere, I saw this massive black figure running on all fours across the grassy island. It was huge. Its head was reaching upwards of 4 feet tall. As it was running, this massive black figure had its mouth wide open. I instantly sensed this dark energy about this being. This was something of the demonic realm. If I can paint what this thing looked like, it would have been very reminiscent of Venom from Spider-Man, minus the tongue, rippling muscles, and the white markings. and this thing stopped, looking at me for a second, and disappeared into the brush. My entire body was screaming at me to turn around and flee, which I did do. I could not get away from this island fast enough. I was paddling like a madman back, and that day, I regret going that far out. Now, I understand this isn't exactly a scary story, but what I saw was something from another realm of existence. I stand by that belief thoroughly. It was evil. This happened some years back. I would like to share my story. At first, I thought it was an escapee from the circus until this story came out. It was evening, around 6 p.m. My mom called me outside to grab something off the porch, so I stood outside and grabbed it. It was a box. When I was coming back down the stairs, I saw this thing standing there. It caught my attention due to its features and hair color. I thought it was just some person, and then I realized that nobody would be outside at this time of day, with that much hair, and that large and dark in color. It was standing there, looking at me, when I came out on the porch. I called my mother to go back inside and get my father. When we came out, the thing was gone. We never saw it again. Now, let me tell you something. I'm 32 years old now, 6'3", and I was scared of it. Every fiber in my being was alerted to this thing's presence, and I just knew deep down this was no person. It carried an aura about it that I just can't explain. I know what I saw, and this thing was huge, standing at the height of the roof. It made no noise. I don't know if it was camouflaged or not, but as soon as it came out, it turned and ran off in a weird way. It's like it knew we were there, and waited until we saw it, before running away. I don't necessarily buy into the whole idea of Bigfoot running amok, although that is what it could have been, I guess, but I highly doubt that. I don't know what I saw, but I know it wasn't a normal person. Paranormal? I'm not sure. I was out with my girlfriend at night, in our area known for being haunted. At least, that's what a lot of our locals tell us. So this night, we were driving, and she said she felt a really strong sense of panic come over her. About 2 minutes later, I noticed my own panic attack start to come on. This wasn't just a fear or dread. It was pure terror that settled into an intense feeling in my chest. This grew stronger the closer we drove to the top of this hill where there's a trail that comes out. We both had a physical reaction to it. Intense chills, goosebumps all over our body, choking up and getting teary-eyed, short of breath for a moment, speeding up when cresting the hill from 60 kilometers an hour to 80 in about 3 seconds. If we had stopped, I'm sure we would have died. This was the most petrifying experience either of us have ever been through in our lives. I've been past many wild animals when driving, and having walked up home at night in the dark a couple of times in well-known bear territory with a bear going through garbage cans across from my neighbors' houses, I didn't have the same type of fear. It was more like being a badass, not this feeling that you're going to die any second. I drove up to a well-lit parking lot after calming down, still shaking really bad, for roughly 10 minutes. I was on very high alert, very anxiety-ridden. I even dreamt of the experience that night, and woke up with a mild return of fear for about 5 minutes before finally falling back asleep. I have not been able to calm down since it happened, still getting chills thinking about it, practically shivering as I write this, nearly 3 days later. My girlfriend even came over last night. She said that she couldn't sleep without me being there beside her to comfort her, until falling back asleep. She heard tapping on my window at about 3 in the morning, which made me shudder, considering how high my window is off the ground, 9 or so feet. We're going to go back out there tonight to record any activity on video if we can manage it. It's only roughly 150 meters from where the encounter took place, or thereabouts. From my experience, it's not something to scoff off if you've ever felt the feeling I did when it was happening. Now, the reason why we felt this fear is because of that figure. That darn figure at the top of that hill that we crested. It was this massive human person-looking shadow. I can't describe it. It just sent terror into us. Whatever it was, I knew it had been watching us from the woodline. And when we saw it standing out in the open, partially illuminated by the moon, but also partially shaded by the trees, that was enough to tell us the reason why we were so fear-stricken. We have a trail near our house. It's also known for being haunted. It used to be an old Indian burial ground, and then a cult was rumored to sacrifice women there during the devil-worshipping days of the 70s. So yeah, it has a bit of this reputation. Anyway, I've never really believed in any of it because I'm not one for being easily afraid. But last night, me and my best friend were out walking this trail at night, around 11 or so p.m. The moon was full and bright in the sky. We didn't really feel like we needed headlamps or flashlights. So we got to the part of the woods where you enter in. That's when he started saying that he felt like something bad was going to happen, like we should turn back. I didn't feel anything myself, so I insisted we keep walking up the trail and try to ignore it by telling him that it was just a bunch of stupid stories that kids made up to spook each other about Halloween, if that's what he's afraid about. 2 minutes later, I start feeling really bad, like pure terror in my chest, and my heart would not stop pounding. We were almost at the top of this hill where the dirt trail comes out into the road, and we both experienced a panic attack. Now, this forced us to sit down in the middle of the path until it subsided enough for us to stand up without wanting to collapse again. We both saw the same thing at the exact same time. I know it wasn't just me freaking out or being weird. 2 glowing red eyes peering over the edge. They were about 30 feet away from us, above a large rock, maybe 7 to 10 feet up in the air. We only caught a glimpse of them before they disappeared over the edge. But I can tell you that it's not something you ever forget once you've seen this. My friend grabs me by the shoulder and drags me back down the road to where we ran as fast as we could, out, until we reached back to my place. He was hanging out with me there at the time. We locked all the doors, closed every blind, and just sat in my room together talking about what it could have been. Was it a person? Was it a ghost? Was it a demon? I tried to look up pictures of big cats and bears and mountain lions and anything of what this thing could have been, and nothing. A large cat or panther, due to those eyes being so huge, but it just didn't match. A bear, but the shape was wrong. That pretty much sums up all the shapes it could have been, despite being that large. There are no wild cats here in Washington state anyway, at least not that can stand on their hind legs and are roughly that large. I don't know what else it could have been watching us from the darkness. Anyway, now every time I walk down that trail at night, all I can picture is those eyes staring at me from over the edge of that rock. I'm pretty sure my buddy feels the same way too. I think we'll probably stay away from there from now on. Recently, my friends and I began to do some paranormal exploring. We found a spot on the side of the road and parked there. We all got out and began walking up the trail. We made it about halfway through when I realized that I did not have my phone on me. Jokingly, I was like, "Guys, I'll be back in 2 minutes." Caitlin, my friend, told me that, well, it'll probably be less than that. I began to walk back down to the car, but our plan was for everybody to stay together. So I told them to wait for me at this rock formation that's near where we were going. So they did, while I went back for my iPhone. Now, here's where it gets creepy. I kept hearing this whistling noise, and I would constantly be looking behind me, with nothing there. Then, I turned around facing forward, thinking I actually didn't hear a thing. The whistling started up again, Only this time, it was closer. I turned around and there was nothing behind me like before. The first night we went up there, we did a test run starting at 10 p.m. Get back to the car about 11:30 p.m. It was pretty scary, but nothing came out of it. We didn't find anything or see anything paranormal. I then heard that if you go up further in the canyon, there is this strange rock formation and some weird lights tend to show up around it. Apparently, it has a very strange energy. So one night, I wanted to go check it out with my friends, Carly, James, Jake, Stacy, Caitlin, and Josh. We have all known each other since elementary school. Obviously, for the sake of this story, all the names have been changed. Now, the second time we went up there is when we experienced some very freaky stuff. Activity or something that I can't quite explain. Check it out. It was about 10:05 p.m., and we all load up in Jake's car and drive to the spot we originally went to. We each got out and started walking our own paths, but loosely staying together. Our plan was for everybody to stay together, so I shouted, "Wait up, guys, I'm coming with you." They all stopped and waved me over, and as we regrouped into one large group, we ascended further into this path. It seemed like we were going deeper into the forest, which is also deeper into the canyon. I looked back at them for a second, then again faced forward on the path. And that's when all of us saw it. It was really white in color and looked like a mass of moving translucent shapes. I stopped in my tracks. They all did too and turned to see what I was looking at. "What's up? Do you see that too?" I asked them. And I was completely put off guard by how much I saw this thing coming toward us. They started walking backwards, briskly, kind of slowly at first and almost cautiously, until they were about 6 feet or more away from me. Then, we all stood there silently, watching this thing get ever so closer, in what seemed like took forever, and then suddenly began to speed up even more. It was terrifying to watch that thing come at us like that. It started making that whistling noise again, only this time, it got so close to where we could feel its breath. We stood there frozen in fear, wondering what it was, or what was going to happen next. We all looked at each other, and I could see the fear in all of our eyes. This was some sort of paranormal energy. I turned around to yell "run," and we all vanished. The whistling noise had stopped while we were running as fast as we could until getting back to the car, where everybody else waited around with worried looks on their faces. We all jumped back in Jake's car and drove home without saying a word about what happened until later. To this day, I still think about that night. Whatever it was, I can't explain it. Do you know what this was? It wasn't a bear, and it was not a mountain lion. It didn't seem like any animal we have in this area or known to exist, period. Has anybody else ever had anything similar happen? I'd love to hear your input. Family and I went camping years ago, and I had a really creepy experience with a demon, or some sort of strange creature that I simply can't explain. We already had a cabin close by, but we were enjoying the solace of the night with tent camping at a very secluded spot. We were out in the forest, and were out one night. I went out to take a piss. It was pitch black, of course, and I'm a pretty sober guy, so I had my flashlight on me, as well as a Swiss Army knife. As I'm finishing up my business, I hear this sound that makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck. It sounded like some sort of distorted howling from a dog, but felt so much more sinister, more so than anything an animal would make. The uneasy feeling is so amplified by the fact there is no light anywhere around us, nothing but darkness everywhere, except for our flashlights. You could cut through the tension with a machete at this point. Because everybody knows at this point something isn't right. The howling became distorted and started sounding more like a demonic growl, Then, the sound just stopped completely. I walked back to camp and told everybody about it, thinking that maybe we were not alone, which is such an eerie feeling coming from the pitch black darkness where you cannot see more than 5 feet in front of your face. Terror was pretty much on all of our faces at this point. My grandfather had also heard it, and he said he has some experience with hunting. He knows good sounds versus bad sounds when it comes to animals. He said that this definitely was not anything normal whatsoever. So I threw a can out in the distance while we were talking about it. But after hearing that noise, I clearly did not want to be out in the darkness of the forest. After throwing this soda can into the blackness, we heard nothing. No sound at all, aside from our voices, for the next following minutes. At this point, everybody was terrified and saw just how serious I was about all of this. As I wandered back over to my tent, which is on the other side of our group campsite, I saw something moving out of the corner of my eye. I assumed at first it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. Super common. So I kept walking down. A minute later, it happened again, but more slightly further away from us than before. Still assuming that it was either shadows or some kind of insect crawling on the rock. We continued back toward our family friend's campsite until something caused me to stop dead in my tracks. The thing I saw was hidden behind a big, log-shaped rock, jumped up on the top of it. It appeared humanoid in shape, dark fur all over its body. The area around its head was bare, no hair whatsoever, and the face came to a sort of point. It was similar to that of a witch's hat, or maybe a goblin's mask. It was crouching, but still taller than I. I'm very short, 5'3", and I stood staring at this thing for 10 seconds before my brain could even register what I was looking at, which is probably why it wasn't more aggressive. Although this thing had weird, strange-looking skin, its fingers were very long and ended with sharp claws that did not look like they were intended for climbing trees. They looked more like they were the claws of a cat or a lizard, how they're very elongated. It kind of resembled an ape, but also stood upright like a person. Its legs appeared to be very short, and it kind of squatted with very long arms. Again, my brain could not comprehend what this was or why it was looking at me the way it did. The only sound I heard for the next few seconds was my own blasting heartbeat in my ears. But after 5 or so seconds of standing still, it became even more aggressive than before. It had jumped down off the rock, squatted on all fours like an ape, while getting into a very aggressive stance. You could tell it was ready to pounce. At this point, I realized that whatever this creature is in no way friendly. I screamed and ran as fast as possible back to the safety of the circle of fire, with my entire family looking over at the commotion, not being able to see what was going on due to it being so dark. The creature took off at a super fast speed, looking over its shoulder as it ran into the woods. I was hysterical at this point and was begging the family that we have to leave now and pack up, that we're not safe. My grandfather knew just how serious I was and immediately jumped into action. Everybody went back to their tents in under a minute, packed up everything in less than 3 minutes. We left the area to go back to our cabin, which was about 20 minutes away. This was no prank. It's not even funny. This thing was real, and I'm terrified for my life every time I think about it. I know there isn't an animal out there that can be aggressive without good reason. I don't ever want to encounter something like this again. But right now, the only way to protect myself is by sharing this story with other people like me who might believe me, instead of judging me, thinking I'm some kind of weirdo liar. This was back in 2015, but still scares the ever-living daylights out of me. It was actually June 25th, 2015. I had went out with a few friends to go and fish for the night. We took my truck and pulled up on this dirt road that we've been down many times before. We knew the area, and we generally felt safe. Obviously, we were watching where we were going, as any sane person would be, because normally, you can't see anything at all. We popped open our beers, sat around talking, when one of the buddies decided he wanted to head back to camp and wanted another beer. I told him it's fine, even though I wasn't that far into mine, but I did not want to leave either. As he walked off, like maybe 50 feet ahead of us, we heard a ruffling in some bushes and then a snort. Now, immediately, we thought it was some other guy trying to mess with us. We all got real quiet and listened. Then again, another snort. What we saw next is something I'll never forget till the day I die. I swear, this thing was no less than 7 feet tall and all black. But it kept shifting colors between dark brown and black, almost like a shadow in the night when you take your eyes off of what it's moving by. The hair on this thing was long and matted looking. It kind of looked like dreadlocks sticking out from its head. What struck me as odd was that there was no signs of eyes anywhere on its body, along with a nose or mouth that we could visibly see. It did have hands, though, that looked human, except they had claws to them instead of fingers. Also, it had a tail of about 4 feet long. From where we could tell, and where it was standing, this was a very bony-looking tail. Now, we were all terrified. None of us could really move or talk, even after it was gone. I tell you now, this wasn't your regular sighting of an animal. I've seen my fair share around here, but this thing had me locking eyes with something that knew exactly what it was doing. This was an intelligent creature. We got in the truck and headed back to camp, where we packed up our stuff and left out of there as fast as possible. I just hope to God nothing like that ever happens to anybody else again. It's not a feeling I would wish on anybody, no matter how many beers they've had in them. Living with my parents right before college, I began to spend most of my time at local malls or having friends over. I had my license, but I couldn't drive myself anywhere because it was just impractical for me. And let's face it, for most teenagers. But this meant that when I wanted to go places with friends, we had to take 2 cars and meet up somewhere. And this is how I came about my experience this summer night. A little bit of background info on me. I live in a relatively small town in central Pennsylvania, population of about 6,000, and that's being generous. We all know each other here, and there isn't much to do besides go to the mall or hang out at somebody's house. So this night, I was meeting up with a couple of friends, and we were going out to eat or something, seeing as my parents were working late. Prior to this night, I had been talking to one of my guy friends for a few days, and we finally decided where we had wanted to meet up at. So it's 9 p.m., and I'm driving down the road that leads into town, since we were looking for spots outside of town to party and let loose. I come around the bend, and suddenly, there were these 2 figures in the middle of the road. I didn't know what they were at first, because it was dark, and all I saw were these 2 dark shapes that walked like humans, but didn't seem human. They were covered in hair, which made me think they might be bears. The one on the left was smaller than the one on the right, but when I looked, they suddenly seemed to appear out of nowhere in front of me and disappear. I slammed on my brakes, swerving around both of them in time to see them both dart off into the thick forest next to the road. There has never been any animals besides deer in this part of town, so I'm still a little confused as to what these things were that I saw. I didn't want to think about it, but a few days later, I began telling my friends about it. They claimed to have seen the same thing. Their proportions were strange, very strange, tall, thin, and lanky, almost like an exaggerated stick figure, if you can imagine that. The bigger one had a hunched back and a long stride, while the smaller one wasn't as tall but looked to have an almost comical duck walk. Their heads seemed small in proportion to their bodies, almost like they were hairless dogs or something. I think I could make out what might be facial features, even though it was dark and I didn't want to stare at them too long. They reminded me of humans that had their body parts stretched out. It was disturbing to look at. I've just been wondering, here, has anybody else had a similar experience? If you have, please let me know. I'm still rather unsettled by all of this. My wife and I were out hiking on a very secluded dirt road near the mountains. We found a spot that we refer to as the Circle. This has a perfect view of the sky and rocks surrounding us on all sides. Without knowing, we ended up going on into a restricted area for public use. We know there was an Air Force base not far, which probably had some kind of Marine training ground. Either way, nobody could find us up there, so we would be safe from people. We had plenty of water, food, supplies, everything else you would need camping-wise. The only thing that was off in the distance, over by where we were, must have been a homesteader, because we could see green pastures and several horses. That was at least half a mile away, and we couldn't see any people, or even hear them. Only thing we could hear was the wind blowing. It wasn't starting to get cold up there, but you could tell it would be soon. We went up there in mid-September, and by October, the night was pretty much uneventful, except for my wife having strange dreams. Probably because she is pregnant, though I never asked her about them when she woke up later on after midnight. I had stayed up there until around 3 o'clock in the morning, just looking at stars and jumping at every little noise I could hear. Nothing ever came of it, so I finally decided to call it a night and try and get some sleep. My wife woke up to me throwing my bag on the ground. I didn't want to lie down anymore, and she had already been quite awake for some time. Now, it was roughly around 4 in the morning that we both got startled by this god-awful scream coming from somewhere deeper in the mountains. Neither one of us knew what could have possibly made that sound, but it's one that has stuck with me, even now as I write these words, months later. We were both scared over whatever was out there. It didn't sound human. It sounded very large and very deep. It had us from what would have been a safe distance to have been looking at each other wide-eyed and scared. My wife and I sat around debating with each other whether it was a bear or maybe some sort of mountain lion, but my wife just refused to believe it. She couldn't accept that that noise came from any normal living animal. This was certainly something terrifying to behold. But it wasn't until around 7 o'clock in the morning, as the sun was rising, we were finally up all night and tired of exhaustion and terror, that we fell asleep again, sleeping next to each other, just in case one of us somehow jolted awake. My wife woke up to me again, asking me if she remembered waking me up last night, to inform me that somebody was outside the tent. Even though I fell asleep late, I don't remember it, but according to her, I had been screamed at and told there was a thing outside the tent touching the outside wall with its long bony fingers. I wish now that we would have recorded this noise. The noise sounded human, but yet something much deeper about it sounded unhuman. It's almost as if that there were some supernatural forces surrounding us that night. One thing's for sure, whatever touched our tent and whatever made the noise stayed completely out of view from us. I was expecting to find some sort of cryptid-like evidence at the end of all this, but there was never anything. No tracks, no sounds, nothing. We were safe for now. But who knows when or where we will cross paths again with these same sounds or creatures. All I know is that this has been going through my head every night as I try to sleep. That scream keeps reappearing. and it has now gone through my mind so many times since writing this. Though now, I know what is happening whenever it happens again. It is the same thing all over again, and I already know if she calls me to wake up, because there is a person outside of her tent touching the side of it with its fingers. That's something that is a nightmare that I will always have that is reoccurring. When I was a kid, my parents used to take me and my sisters camping at the coast of Alaska nearly every summer. We'd spend hours playing in the sand, building these elaborate forts, and running through the dunes all day long. But as night would creep on our campsite on the beach, we'd always hear this eerie sound coming from the water, and it always seemed to be growing closer by the minute. It sounded like somebody was throwing something metal around on the rocks, and were now growing closer and closer. My parents were always very quick to dismiss it, but the sound continued to get louder, and then coming out towards our tent, but would always stop before reaching us. Like I said, my parents were quick to dismiss it as a nightmare, and they were right. It was a nightmare. A living one. It was always an incredibly terrifying experience, one that my sisters and I swear to this day is more than real. One evening, we stepped out because I had to go pee. My parents were fast asleep, and we heard the noise. My sisters and I both looked, and we saw what it was. What was making the noise was this strange creature swimming close to the shore and then surfacing. We saw its head and parts of its fin before it submerged again. The night was getting very dark, so we could just barely see the shape of this thing's body as it moved away from us and out back into the water. We were terrified. Our eyes were wide open. We don't think the creature saw us, and if it did, we think it may have tried to stay hidden. We stayed there and stared at the water where this thing had just appeared from. That summer was my first time ever seeing this strange creature, and also my last. The creature, to my knowledge and my sister's knowledge, never came back that year or any other year after that. I can't even begin to try explaining what it is that I saw. All I know is that I'll always remember those days on the coast with a certain fondness after that strange, terrifying experience. The very next day, my mother told me that it was just a dream, but I knew it wasn't. I had never seen this creature before. I also recognized that it was very large. It had to have at least been 6 feet tall had it been standing upright, and it appeared to have a tail, from what I could tell or make out. I assume it was some sort of sea serpent, but I can't be sure. My sisters say that it kind of reminded them of a cross between a man and a sea serpent type thing. It really scared all of us. I went fishing with my family a few Saturdays ago. It was a beautiful day in July, but I swear that I saw something in the water I don't normally see. It's something that really stood out to me, and I don't usually fish this far out. I wanted to catch some yellowtail. We were about 100 feet out on the ocean side, 3 miles from shore. We had just put out our lines down when my brother-in-law began yelling at us that he saw something. He said it looked like a monster, or something was coming up for air about 20 yards away from us. When we saw it, we caught a glimpse of what appeared to be this brownish-colored fish dinosaur thing. It was going through the water really quick, like flying, soaring, and to say it looked prehistoric is an understatement. We were all pretty shocked at what we were seeing. It was definitely a monster. It obviously saw us because it disappeared into the water, never surfacing again. I know many people have seen things like this before, but I'm not sure what it could have been.
and I'm still pretty shocked it happened. My guess is that it was possibly some prehistoric fish of some sort. It kind of looked like it'd be in the family of sturgeon, but it definitely was not a sturgeon. But it kind of had that look, if you know what I mean. Very ancient looking. It was brown and much larger. Too bad it disappeared too quickly before we can get a good look at it. The ocean is home to all sorts of mysteries, so once again, I'm not surprised we saw something we cannot explain. My youngest son, his daughter, and I were staying at a family friend's home on the beach so we could do some crabbing. We even made a fire that evening to cook our crabs while we waited for them to become available. It was late August in San Diego, and there is a very small window of time between twilight and the darkness. Perhaps this is why we saw what we did. Now, I'll go ahead and put a forward on this and say, I don't know if this was a UFO. I don't know what this was, but we saw some sort of interdimensional anomaly. We started to notice that most of the people had left the beach. It was just us, and a couple in their 50s or 60s, standing 150 feet away. As it got darker, we could see them, but they couldn't see us. They were close enough that we heard some of what they were saying to each other. There was nothing unusual at first about their conversation, but it did surprise me a bit when I realized we were talking about the same thing. I mentioned earlier that it was dark, but not completely, and there were no streetlights or anything to illuminate the night sky. I'm trying to paint a picture here, that it was dark, and there was lots of stars out. However, we noticed one area of stars that seemed to be brighter than the rest, and somewhat closer to the horizon than anything else in the sky. The couple also noticed this, judging by their gestures and body reaction, and they even commented about it with each other. Now, we had only been watching for a few moments when we all, my kids, me, and them, saw something moving through these brightened stars on what appeared to be a collision course with us, referring to our location at ground level. It emerged from this cluster of stars and into our atmosphere, just above the ocean. I would guess it was about 400 to 500 feet in front of us, but it was difficult to gauge its distance due to how bright it was, almost like seeing a star that is as close to one and further away would be. The object appeared to be oval-shaped and about 30 to 40 feet long. It moved incredibly fast, and at first, we thought it was going to crash into the water, but instead, it slowed down and turned upwards towards our position, at which time I realized that I could see through what appeared to be clear or slightly translucent skin. This made me convinced that this wasn't a craft being piloted by humans. There were no visible seams or joints. It was something else entirely, almost like this loose shape. But then it began to change. Then it began to take the shape of this strange, eel-looking creature. This astral, ethereal, eel-looking creature. We were all shocked, and its skin reflected the ambient light in the same way that living things underwater often do. It also had lumps in 2 rows on either side, which appeared like gills, and these gills were bright white and flared open, similar to how an eel's gills do when agitated, but they were not really moving. This thing didn't have any eyes that I could tell, but it definitely knew we were there, as soon as it slowed down enough so that it didn't appear to be just a bright light. It turned so that we were looking right at its face. I just remember feeling the feeling of weightlessness and awe as I watched this creature or thing swim, fly, however you would describe this, past us, about 100 or so feet above our heads. It continued towards the couple in front of us, and then silently flew over them where they remained still, but then stopped moving forward about 100 feet beyond them, and stayed suspended
for another 5 seconds before shooting straight up into the atmosphere and then going completely out of sight. A few moments later, the man called out from where he had been standing with his wife, asking if we just saw what we thought we just did. We all agreed that we had, and we all consider this the most shocking, terrifying, and bizarre UFO experience any one of us could ever go through. At least, that's what I assume this was. I still have no answers to what we saw, and if this was some sort of grand group hallucination, I guess that's a reality. What do you think of my story? What could this have been? I've heard stories of UFOs, but never one like this, where an object appears to change shape into an actual living creature like this, that was not only translucent, but appeared to be interdimensional of some kind. Went boating on the Okanagan Lake years ago with my wife and kids, when suddenly the boat stopped. I asked my wife if we were stuck in some kind of sandbar, so I turned around to back up and had a look on the sonar. It showed there was at least water under us. However, as I backed up, you could start to see several large rocks just below the surface, and all of a sudden, my wife let out this ear-piercing scream as she was looking over her shoulder toward the rear of our boat, at which time our 2 kids began screaming and crying. I looked behind us to see this large dark object, roughly 25 feet long, moving fast through the water, away from shore, away from us. This thing looked like something alive. It had to have been at least 40 feet deep. It was too big to just be a shadow. We were on the surface of the water. I cannot swim, and my wife was no accomplished swimmer either. Needless to say, we went back in full throttle. After that day, I have never been back out on any lake or waterway. Actually, to be honest, I am petrified by any body of water. In 1970, me and 3 friends decided to go camping up north, several miles from Florence, Oregon. It was pretty isolated, except for one other camp a few hundred feet down the beach. We all laid around during the day while the other camp packed up and left. Around 9 p.m., we all went to sleep in our tents, leaving a lantern on for light, since it was a full moon. Around 11 p.m., I woke up to the front of my tent being partially open, and I noticed water dripping. Then, things began to happen very quick. I heard the strange sound and water dripping. Then, this huge head hanging right above, over the top of the opening, and all I could see were these black eyes, at least 3 inches across, flaring flat nostrils, no hair or scales or fur. I couldn't move away. I was terrified and frozen with fear. It stayed there for what seemed like forever, staring at me, before slowly swiping its hand out of the opening and disappearing. When I finally got the nerve to move, I packed up and left. To this day, I can't stand to go near any body of water, assuming this was some sort of strange lake creature. This is the tale of the White Lake Monster. My grandmother lives in Twin Lakes, which lies on LA Route 27. The closest town would be St. Martinville. Anyway, one day, my mama was home alone since her sister Beatrix had to work at 3 p.m. on Halloween. My mother decided to take us back, hunting for deer, with a friend. My mom also asked if she could drop me off. We had gotten some candy treats already that day from other relatives coming by our house. I said no because my cousin was trick-or-treating. It wouldn't feel right going without him. So, she dropped me off around 5. A few hours of not finding anything, we decided to head home and go inside, which is when grandmother said she's seen a big animal swimming in the water. A few nights later, my mom's friend Crystal went back to the lake to check out what it was. She told me grandmother that it might be a Cypress Lake monster. She also mentioned it might be the Rougarou. The next day, November 1st, I begged my grandmother until finally she gave in. So we took some of her fishing poles with us. And we came across this huge mud hole. It looked like something had been there. It was all torn up. But we insisted on going further down the road. And then we see this huge white thing in the water swimming right to the left of us. And we could see its scales. That's just how close it was. Now, Grandma said before that that was a monster. So we waited for it to disappear before running back and telling her. We were shocked. This looked like some sort of long white fish, but never have I seen anything like it before. Sorry, I'm not a good writer, but I thought that this sighting was interesting. This occurred on August 11th, 2019. I went to one of my favorite spots on the lake, 2.5 miles from the closest residential area. I like coming here. It's quiet and out of the way, but still close enough that I can get back to the shore in 5 minutes, assuming something goes wrong. I was fishing with a friend, and we were catching plenty of fish, mostly small sunfish. But our biggest catch yet was a large bass. It started getting dark around 7:30 p.m., so my buddy left, going back to his car, and called it an early night. He had to be at work the next day at 6 a.m. I ended up staying until around 10 p.m. I was having no luck catching any fish. The lake was a decent size, about 10 square miles roughly, and part of it being very deep, over 100 feet. When I was about to pack up and leave, I saw something clear moving through the water about 200 yards away from me. And that's when I noticed there were hundreds of them. These large, clear creatures swimming around really fast in almost every direction. They were translucent, kind of like jellyfish, but larger and a lot more fluid movement. They also seemed to have this glow. There were also these red-orange shapes going through the water at extremely high speeds, seemingly trying to eat the other ones. It reminded me of some videos I've seen before, so I stayed there watching it for about an hour until I finally got a little too scared and decided to leave. I didn't know what these creatures were. I tried to Google stuff about this lake once I got back home, but nothing came up. It wasn't until 2 days later that my mind was jogged when some guy on Reddit posted a video of something similar. The monsters looked exactly like the ones I saw. I call them monsters, but really, I think they're just some unknown fish or something. What do you think these might have been? Did anybody else see these? I'm posting here on this thread for now, but if anybody can reply, I would really appreciate that. I was fishing from the banks in Oregon during an evening. This was actually at Sanford Lake. A couple of friends and I were catching cutthroat trout when we noticed something very odd just under the surface on my side of the lake. There was this creature that had a long serpent-like body and large flippers or fins on each side. It kind of reminded us of a flying fish. The head had these weird triangular shapes pointing down to its mouth and didn't appear to have any eyes at all. This fish also had some type of appendages coming off its back, kind of like some fish you would see. Not sure what these were, but they resembled almost tentacles, which looked frayed and torn apart. There was no sound produced by this fish, and it did not appear to have gills. This thing was swimming very fast and would be making sharp turns, darting back and forth across the lake. Once, this thing partially lunged out of the water, and we got to see a lot of its body. It looked far different, and it made this strange noise.
When I say big, this thing was roughly maybe 9 to 10 feet long, and maybe 2 to 3 feet wide. All this happened within 10 minutes' time, as if it were looking for food or something. We did finally depart the Sanford Lake, but I am very intrigued by nature, and I spend lots of time outdoors, camping, fishing, boating, hiking, etc. I've seen some odd things in nature, but this was by far the most bizarre. I hope I can find out more about it soon. Anybody with any answers, I'd greatly appreciate you posting a reply. This happened to me this summer, around late June, early July. It was right before 4th of July. I live by the St. Clair River, which I've always heard rumors about of a lake monster and other strange thing in it. So it's always been on my bucket list of places to investigate for myself. Also, I guess there's an old lighthouse that is said to have paranormal activity. Let me start off by saying, both I work as a career firefighter and am a certified EMT. So when I tell you what I saw, please, trust that I'm not lying or just trying to make something up. In fact, my username is anonymous for that reason. I don't want my real name in any part of this connected. Late one night, after fishing on our station, we were all hanging out at one of my friends' houses discussing our days while browsing social media, when some of us started to see a story pop up on our Facebook. This was about a group of hunters had found what they believed to be an unidentified carcass in Lake St. Clair, and that the police were investigating it. So, we're all looking at this post when one of my other friends, who is a very active duty military and also has been for quite some time with the special operations training, he tells us that he knows somebody who was there when it happened. Apparently, his unit was only told it was closed for training exercises, while it was really to come investigate this thing. Mind you, both he and my other friend have been out on boats before hunting deer season, so they know their way around. So he's telling us that basically these hunters had originally reported seeing something very similar to what they would refer to as a plesiosaur. As it was coming up to their boat, they all freaked out. One guy had the presence of mind to take a picture before this thing went underwater. It sounds pretty crazy, but he's my friend. I'm inclined to believe him. Plus, where we are is not only an old Indian burial ground nearby, but has also been a hot spot for Bigfoot sightings, UFO sightings, and other various phenomena. So, I don't really find it that far-fetched anymore that these things exist. After he told us about what he knew about this creature, one of my other friends says, "What if it comes back? We should go investigate." At first, I figured she was just joking. She likes watching cryptid shows and whatnot. But then, she and another friend, the only other female in our group, said to us, "We should go out onto the river tonight. And since there's no moon, maybe we can see if we can find it." I tried to tell them that they were crazy, but by this point, they had already talked me into going, so we all decided to meet at my house around midnight, after everybody was done with their work fully, or responsibilities for the night. Now, these three friends are some of my more adventurous friends. We've even gone ghost hunting before, more so their idea. These three also had gone on a Bigfoot expedition. Of course, they never found any evidence. Needless to say, I was excited about the adventure, and the outcome. It was just something fun and different to do. So, about 30 to 45 minutes later, it's now past midnight, and we all finally meet outside, right on the riverbank, and this is where we have our 3 canoes. This is where we kept all 3 of our canoes, and with all our fishing gear. These canoes are very expensive. We tie them up to the bank, grab whatever flashlights we can find, and head out on the river with one person in each canoe. I'm not gonna lie, we were pretty scared. It wasn't exactly the wisest decision, but I guess we've done crazier things. Plus,
I had a friend who was more adventurous than all of us. He was kind of being the leader, or what I like to refer to as the designated driver. Nothing really happened for the first 30 or so minutes, at least that I can remember. We spotted a log floating in the water, and we all laughed and joked about how it might be our monster. After several minutes of following it downstream, I turn to look at them and ask if they're still watching it. I've lost sight of it since moving further down the river. I wasn't staring or anything, just looking around while waiting for them to answer. That's when both friends I'm riding with shout, "Holy crap!" as they frantically start paddling back towards where we came from. So naturally, I think something's happened. Somebody must have fell out of their canoe, so immediately, I start paddling forward, and then spot what looks like kind of a log, but also like a large snake, poking out from the water, and kind of thrashing around as if trying to stay afloat. I know, I'm probably doing a terrible job explaining this story, but it's hard to make sense of what I saw at first. It happened so quickly, and I only caught a quick glimpse of it before being thrown into confusion or excitement. I don't know what emotion you'd call what I felt. And then, suddenly, the thing had looked like a log went underwater and didn't come back up, while my other two friends began yelling, "Go, go, go, fast!" So, I paddle faster downriver, confused as why, what is going on? Why is everybody in such a hurry? When all of a sudden, one friend who's riding with me starts screaming about something, but all I could understand from him was, "Brother, he's underwater." So naturally, thinking my other friend has fallen out of his canoe, without the life jacket on or something equally as stupid, I turn back and see that his canoe has completely capsized. He was able to forcefully turn his canoe back over. Somehow, he's soaking wet and he is scared, terrified. I was shocked the way the man was able to uncapsize his own canoe. That alone seemed impossible. But he's screaming that something took his canoe down. We needed to go now. Screaming, yelling. That's all I remember from him. Anyway, I wanted to ask you guys for advice. It sounds like something happened. Something large under the water was trying to take my friend down. Except this was something far different than a fish. When I talk to the same friend now, he has PTSD about it, almost nearly dying. He claims the monster was going to get him, and since when any of us ran off so quickly, the other friends didn't fall into the river. So for a little bit, we tried getting back to shore, calling, shouting, signaling, but we couldn't really get any response from anybody else around us. We were able to finally make it back to shore, where we were soaking wet and terrified, and my poor friend, who had capsized in his own canoe, he was just shaken up and would not talk. When we kind of got him to calm down more, he claimed something large came under his canoe in the river and nearly tipped him over and tried to pull him out. He was scared, still is scared. I'm looking for answers. We have no idea what it was. Do I believe it was a plesiosaur? I don't know. He didn't really give a description of what it was, but something was trying to kill him or eat him or pull him out of that canoe. He was also the one in the very back. I was out on a very small lake on the outskirts of Detroit, hanging with some friends. We decided to go swimming in it. Well, we were young and dumb. Kids tend to do this at this age. I know how ignorant this sounds, but after a long summer day, all you want to do is cool down and be free for a moment. We had been out there for maybe an hour or so, just enjoying each other's company. And that's when we heard someone shouting for help, alongside the road next to the lake. The water was fairly shallow enough, and we could stand up if needed, so my three buddies ran over towards him, trying their best to see what he wanted, while I stayed back, near the edge of the lake. Now, this guy was a very large man, and a real sight to behold. We were young and dumb, like I said. We probably could have taken him if need be, but it didn't. He had been running through the woods, sticking to the edge of the lake, trying his best not to get caught as he made his way towards us. When my friends finally got over there and realized what was going on, they told me afterwards that he looked terrified out of his mind and not coming to assault us. Yeah, you already know where this is going. He frantically pleaded with us, asking us if we had seen anything weird coming from the water before he was running through the woods. We looked at each other a bit confused. We were confused and had no idea what he meant. Shrugged it off. I mean, we were just high school kids. We had no idea what was even possible to come from the water, let alone having seen anything like what he was saying. So we honestly just told him no, and asked him why. He stopped for a moment, catching his breath as he panted heavily under his large frame while staring down at the road where he came from. He spoke again, and all of us could feel the very air being sucked out from around us, and every hair on our necks stand up with goosebumps forming across our flesh, listening to the words none of us would have ever thought to hear. The guy said in between breaths, "I were running through the woods when I saw it. This thing coming up out of the water, just coming right at me. It had huge black eyes and a large black frame, scaly, these long spiked fins along its back. This thing was unlike anything I've ever seen before. It was alien. It looked like the creature from the Black Lagoon. I thought it was a prank, but there's no way this could have been one." Hearing these words, I thought he was pranking us, but seeing him get so worked up and emotional, you could tell he was reliving this horrifying experience. Thinking about what he said, seeing this thing head before he swallowed hard, as if trying to force down every bit of fear he felt inside, while letting out one last deep breath. He told us how it wasn't more than 20 feet away from him, where the three of us stood now, and with more conviction in his voice than ever before. We could tell by the look on his face, he truly believed every word coming out of his mouth. We just stood there in silence for a good while, nobody really knowing what to say. I'm sure you know what we were thinking too. We wanted him to think we believed him, so we could get rid of him and just go on swimming like nothing happened. Because, honestly, this seemed so weird. Who would believe this? In my head, I just assumed this guy was having some sort of manic mental breakdown or something. Some hallucination. I mean, it sounded ridiculous, telling us such wild stories. None of us bothered to ask if he had been drinking or something, but we didn't spill any booze on him. Still in shock by what he told us, and feeling utterly petrified, no less, my friends and I just let him be, and went back to enjoying our time together near the lake, as nothing had happened at all. We were all still surprised at how this guy had appeared out of nowhere, and told us such stories about what he saw, coming from the water, and running away in terror. You know, none of us really wanted to admit to ourselves that we actually believed him. At least I didn't, but my friends would later tell me. I think deep down inside, we all knew that his words weren't just lies being passed off. If they were, he was the world's best actor. Now, that evening was uneventful, aside from one thing which I'm sure you've already guessed. There was a noise again, like there had been the previous night. Except this time, it wasn't just coming from one place. It sounded as if the whole lake itself was alive, wailing sounds through the entire depth, and it lasted for maybe 12 minutes. Then everything was finally quiet, as if nothing bad had happened. Now this freaked us all out. Either there was some sort of paranormal thing happening, or something. The next day, we all decided to gather at the lake. Smart, right? Because something was obviously going on. Now we were seriously creeped out. At first the guy seeing this strange creature out of the water, and then the next this horrifying screaming from the lake. We couldn't make sense out of what was happening. I mean, we weren't even sure where to even start. I feel like we should have called the Scooby-Doo gang on us. But eventually, our gut got the better of us, and we finally came clean with one another in the midst of all this about believing the man. Because honestly now, we had no reasonable explanation for what had just been going on here. While we never saw a sea monster quite yet, we experienced the screaming, which was strange. So a following night, we're back yet again at the lake with some other friends who had come to see what was going on. Now, we're all terrified to get in the water. We all told them about our tall tale friend and his stories, but we didn't mention anything about this monster, not wanting to give any of us more reason to freak out than necessary. It only took a few minutes, though, before we began hearing noises coming from the same direction that, we'll call the man Ryan, said he'd heard it from in the first place. It sounded like something big was moving around. Now, we were all scared, and I felt myself growing pale, looking around to see if there could have been any explanation. In fear, none of us were able to say a word. We all kind of whisper-panicked, asking one another if they hadn't just heard that too, or what it was. Once again, we were looking everywhere, but there wasn't any sign of anything out there in the water, or along the edge where it was lapping against the shore. Eventually, we decided to just play it safe. This part is still so vivid in my memory, as if it happened only yesterday. We heard some rustling next to us, and we all looked, and we could see this large shape moving toward us in the dark, in the woods. Something large, something dark, moving in the same direction that Ryan had told us about a few nights previous. It appeared to be big and standing upright like a large man. This was enough for us. We all panicked, and for whatever reason, we decided to run, to flee. Now, we had never saw that other man anymore, who we called Ryan, but we weren't going to tolerate this any longer. We tried to play the investigator game, but to no luck. This lake was obviously haunted or something. Some sort of crazy paranormal thing going on about it. Between the screaming and the strange noises and the feelings and this thing now watching us, I couldn't figure out what was going on. For several nights now, this had been going on, and this was more than enough for us.
Hello, what lurks beneath? I have some interesting stories for you. I've been trying to do some digging on the whole dogman phenomenon, and I actually found an account of one that dates all the way back to 1887, and it has to deal with a small crew of lumberjacks back in Northern California. From what I've gathered with the information, this group of lumberjacks were scouting a new logging area, and apparently, all 6 of them report seeing tall beasts emerge from the trees, running across the pathways and disappearing. They reported these as extremely large canines, walking upright, black in color, and having very pointed ears. This scared all of them very much. However, their foreman decided to press onward, and they would continue to see these creatures again and again in the same area. But they would always run away before they could do much. They referred to these creatures by several different names, one being timber beasts, the other known as the lumberjack devil. Eventually, they began seeing these creatures more and more frequently, as they began expanding in this area. The foreman did not believe them, and continued onward. And at some point, I think about 3 months into the whole process, 2 of the 6 lumberjacks went missing. Nobody could find any trace of them, and the other 4 lumberjacks abandoned the expansion altogether. The foreman was unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, not able to hire on more lumberjacks willing to do the job, but the reports were terrifying. He'd went out there himself to survey things, to try and find these missing lumberjacks, when he too finally reported seeing the same strange creatures that his crew had seen. Some information that I really wanted to fill you in on is that foreman was my great-grandfather. and I actually have written documentation of his 3-page terrifying encounters with these things. And apparently, judging from his writing, they almost killed him. And he believes he stumbled upon some of their territory, and they acted very, very hostile towards him. The geographic area was very dense timber, lots of wilderness, untouched by man, and this is more word of mouth than anything else, but I guess some of the natives wouldn't even go out here. They were too afraid of these creatures. Now, I don't know about you, but I find the accounts to be incredibly interesting. My grandmother actually holds possession of these journals, and while I read it a while ago, maybe I can pull them out and actually write you the stories written by him. I want to be careful though. I've heard all sorts of other stories about people having their photos and video evidence confiscated, or worse, being interrogated. So I want to try and keep this on the down low as much as possible. You'll be hearing from me again soon. The Buckeye Creek Wilderness is located about 30 miles outside of Phoenix, Arizona, and just south of Route 85. According to one local man who frequents the area, is known as Death Valley, and he claims there are far more coyotes and mountain lions in this wilderness. In fact, he says or claims it's infested with werewolves, but he clarifies, it's not like a movie werewolf. These are real-life dog creatures. So what did he see exactly? It appeared to look like a person running on all fours across the road. He went on to say that when he saw the creature, it quickly disappeared into some brush, then reappeared much closer to his truck, claims this thing was mocking him. The man shared that he had seen this creature 3 times now, and has gone back to the area where he first spotted it. He didn't see it again, but a lot of his friends and him saw a lot of other weirdness, including strange lights in the sky. He goes on to share that the last time he went out there, he also found human-like tracks, but they were really large and more canine-looking. His most frightening encounter is detailed. I had somebody with me, which is why we were going back. We're not going to drive all the way out there for nothing. When asked if they got photos or video footage of what he says, yes and no. We did get some pictures of stuff we saw, but when it comes to this werewolf-looking thing, no. When asked if somebody could have been playing tricks on him, or setting up a Halloween prank by dressing up as a creature, he claims that it was definitely real. When I was a kid, I had to walk up a hill every day to get home from school. Now, there is a back road, or kind of a trail that leads through the woods, and there used to be this old abandoned house. It had been long abandoned by many, many years. We're surprised that due to the weathering, it hadn't fully collapsed. Well, one day, while walking home, as my friends and I were coming down the hill, we saw something big moving around this old house. It kind of appeared to be a large person, but it had the ears of a dog on top of its head, and it was like it was crouched down, looking at us from behind some trees. I pointed out to it as we were seeing this thing, and began running back up the hill towards my house, with my friends following right behind me. As soon as we get into our houses, we ran inside our homes. We were terrified. We decided that after this day, we would never go down that road again. But years later, my friends and I decided to go back down the road where we saw what we all thought was, do I dare say it, a werewolf. The old house was still there. In fact, it looked in worse condition. Graffiti, a little bit more broken down. Clearly, at some point or another, there had been homeless activity around here, hence the garbage and graffiti. It had completely overgrown, worse than before. It was getting dark, and our curiosity and faux bravery got the best of us. So, we decided to go inside this house, just looking through it out of curiosity. We kept spooking each other, telling us the werewolf lived inside here.
Of course, we got in there and everything was dusty, abandoned, and broken. We kind of searched for the first floor, just looking around, and we heard something big moving around upstairs. We froze for a brief second, and it sounded like something was slowly making its way down the stairs. That's when we decided to run out through the window of the house, back, right where we came. We did not want to know what this could have been. This was easily, probably one of the most terrifying times when me and my friends saw something unusual during our childhood years. Sure, I have no way to prove that this was indeed the same creature, or perhaps a werewolf of some kind, but it sounded unusually heavy, and like it, he or she, whoever it was trying to be extra quiet when sneaking down. But the house was so old, everything kind of creaked and groaned. Now, I will say that the creature my friends and I saw years ago was indeed something that we had never seen before. Something very out of place. It was a cold October morning. The year was 1977 when I first saw it. I was about 6 or 7 years old at the time, and my big sister, who I'll call Stacy, had just started high school. We lived in a house on the outskirts of Klamath Falls in Oregon, near a very heavily forested area we referred to as the Back 40. The Back 40 was pretty empty, but it was also next to a large farmhouse and a well-maintained gravel road. Now, we called the Back 40 because it was untamed wilderness and timber, stretching roughly 40 to 50 acres, if not more. Now, my mother owned 2 dogs at the time, both smallish mutts, one named Jellybean and another Sally Mae. That morning, I woke up before anybody else, went out to get some cereal for breakfast, and I noticed something large moving through the backyard. It was blueberry season here in Oregon, and the bushes were swaying back and forth. So naturally, I think I just assumed it was a large animal, some sort of stag perhaps. But then, something forward came out. It was a large canine. At first, I think I thought it was a neighbor's dog, but it got close enough for me to see its face, and I stopped dead in my tracks as I'm getting the cereal, and felt this sinking feeling in my stomach. I, for some reason, don't remember why, but I was drawn to the back door, and even stepped outside. I felt like I was in a trance-like state, and I couldn't control my own thoughts or movement. It's like something was drawing me closer to this thing. It had a snout that was more elongated like a deer, with sharp teeth jutting out of its mouth behind its lips, kind of like fangs but all over. Its eyes were very deep, very set in. The fur was black as night, and its eyes were a stark, shining yellow. It was menacing and unnatural. The creature continued in my direction. As it came closer, I could make out what looked to be a human form with animalistic features. It stood upright like a man, but its features resembled that of a wolf. It had brownish-gray fur all over its body, and the face of a wolf. The creature looked much bigger than any other normal wolf should have been. And then, it got down on all 4, with its head roughly about 3 or so feet off the ground, and then standing back upright on 2, like it wasn't sure whether it wanted to stand on 2 legs or be down on all 4. As it approached closer and closer, I somehow regained feeling over my body. That's the only way I can describe it, running inside and telling my mom. She didn't believe me at first, but she could see I was visibly distressed, so she went outside to comfort me, and she could see this thing off in the distance, standing on 2 legs, just as it was before. This thing looked over in the direction of our house, and then turned and walked away towards the back 40. My mother would later call animal control, who arrived several hours later. I guess they searched almost every inch of that forest, but never found anything too out of the ordinary, except exceptionally large wolf prints, which I guess, for Oregon, were some of the largest wolf prints found. Even my sister Stacy said that her bus driver had reported seeing strange, unusually large dogs around the area. I asked my mom if it was possible that we were somehow, I don't know, living close to a portal of some kind. She quickly claimed that portals do not exist, and that at the time, I was probably just having a dream, since I should have been asleep normally, and I woke up early. This story is true, at least as much as my memory serves, and happened in Klamath Falls, Oregon. The reason I am sharing this with you is because there have been several dogman sightings reported recently in Northern California. It's got a very similar landscape to Southern Oregon, particularly high desert regions infested with thick forests and canyons. Even today, as an adult, I'm still not really sure what to make of this memory. I was on a trip to the Oregon coast when I had what might have been the scariest experience I've ever had. It was late at night, and we were driving back from Astoria. We were in a parking lot near the beach, getting ready to stop for coffee before heading home. And suddenly, this huge wolf creature coming out of nowhere. He started howling and running loudly toward our car. My son, who caught it, screamed, "Dad!" and got scared and pointed out the window where this thing had come from. The next thing I know, it's charging directly at our vehicle with its arms out. I don't know what it was, but I'm sure my doors were locked. Every time we would fly to a new location on the coast that night and stop somewhere, I would always be nervous looking over my shoulder. It's like I could still see it running from afar, running in my rearview mirror, even though I probably didn't. It was fast and incredibly strong. Whenever I sped away from this thing, it would keep up with us, finally disappearing. It gave me chills every time it came towards the window, like we were slowing down, but we weren't at all. At that point, I even let off the gas pedal. My wife, who was very confused and scared, she wasn't really sure what to make of it, other than just scream her head off that this large wolf animal was chasing after our vehicle. Once we were back at our hotel, since we couldn't make it home that night, we didn't deem it safe. My son and I could not stop talking about it. We told other people about what had happened. Of course, they didn't believe us. This creature was some huge, growling, werewolf-looking thing. It had a long snout, really large teeth, and it had this horrible screech as it got close to the driver's side door. I was in panic mode trying to get away from this thing. In fact, the whole ordeal is kind of a blur to me. I don't know what it was, but it was after us that night. And so far, I've told my story to many people who don't have a lot of interest. But this is the most accurate description of what happened. This thing definitely ran on two legs like a person, but it had features like a dog. It appeared it could jump over and get over cars across from ours where we parked. Its eyes were a bright yellow too, kind of like a wolf hybrid or something. I don't know. Maybe all these stories are connected. Whatever it is, he scared me pretty badly, and I still worry about driving on roads at night. I was really scared and wanted to get out of there overall. I honestly think this thing was just toying with us, because it clearly could have killed us if it wanted to. I'm sorry I'm not the best writer in the world. I just thought I wanted to quickly get my thoughts jotted down, so hopefully you can kind of read between the lines of my mess of writing and get the story out of it. Anyway, it's always scary thinking about how close we came to dying that night. I have always been the type of person to never really be scared of anything. But on July 18th, 2018, that all changed. I always thought people who claimed they saw things like this were just making it up. But after what happened with me, I have a completely different perspective now. around 7 p.m. I was walking home from my job as a manager of a small convenience store here in town. It was a pretty cloudy day, and it was rather dark outside around the time I began walking. When I got about halfway home, which would be about a 10 to 15 minute walk from where my store is located in town to my house, out on the countryside. Just as I began passing by a huge field that has been vacant for as long as I can remember, this huge monster-looking dog ran out of the woods on the other side of the field. This thing came out at full speed and began chasing me. All I could see was its eyes, teeth and paws running after me, like some sort of werewolf or something. But it looked more like a wolf than anything else. I ran and screamed as it was running after me. Eventually, it stopped chasing me. After I got home, my mother told me that she could hear the screams from inside the house. It sounded like some type of weird animal scream or high-pitched noise. Another note about this story is just a few months earlier in April, I saw something very strange in my yard one morning. There were these huge footprints all over my lawn, and there were uprooted grass everywhere in two separate areas, about 20 feet apart from one another. The size of the prints were so large, they didn't even fit where my hand would be. I had placed my hand down on the ground, and these wolf prints, I assume, were much larger than I could ever imagine. I'm still pretty unnerved by all of that, as you could expect it to be. It's been almost 3 years now since this all happened, and I'm still shaken up by what it was and what it could have been. If you had asked me a while ago, I would have told you that nothing like this would ever scare me. But just thinking back on this nightmare, it gives me chills. One night, just outside of Portland, Oregon, pre-pandemic life, I was taking a walk with my girlfriend. As we walked down the sidewalk, I stopped when I heard what sounded like bushes rustling. I thought we were maybe going to get jumped, but from the corner of my eye, I saw something moving in the distance, something dark. Quick note, I'd like to start by saying that this is a true story about my encounter. I've been very hesitant to share it with others, for fear that they'll think I'm crazy. But I've always wanted more people to know what happened that night. As soon as I stopped walking, the mysterious figure froze and stared at me. It was still too dark for any detail to be visible, but whatever, it seemed animalistic. And for some reason, my girlfriend insisted we keep walking, even though she saw something too. In all honesty, I can't say if it would have chased us or not, because after seeing how scared she was, and knowing her disposition towards dogs, I told her we should go back. I'd also like to note that the whole time I was facing this creature, it did not make any noise other than the rustle of bushes in a light breeze. Its eyes were extremely bright and followed us as we walked away. I'm not sure what it was or what it wanted, but I can say that I saw something dark and canine-like. I have no doubt in my mind that something odd is going on in these more remote areas. Did I mention how bright its eyes were? The rest of it was still too dark to make out, other than a general silhouette, and that it appeared to look like a large, dog-sized figure. A few days later, out of curiosity and more than anything else, my girlfriend and I took a drive back to where we had seen the creature. We went very early in the morning, so there would be nothing around us. In hindsight, this doesn't make much sense. If there was some demon dogman thing out there, walking around that early in the morning probably would not have scared it. In any case, we saw nothing but trees and brush when we arrived to our destination. After about 20 minutes of driving around aimlessly, I had a feeling of something watching us. My girlfriend started freaking out, saying she felt like somebody was behind her as well, which only made things worse. So, I started speeding up until we were almost back to my house. Once we got back home and walking inside, my girlfriend said she swore somebody followed us back. To this day, she swears it was true. I'd also like to note that both of our phones were acting very strange while we were out in this area. That includes the night of the walk and the morning when we drove back. We would get this weird cell phone staticky reception coming out of our phones. It was very strange. But that night, I did some research on dogmen and creatures similar to what I saw. There have been a lot of sightings throughout Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, to name a few, with many reports describing this odd black figure just outside windows at nighttime. Some people believe these are dogman encounters, while others are convinced that these are completely different hybrid entities. The descriptions range from an upright animal walking on all fours to something far more human-like, but still carry a wolfish appearance. I've never been a believer in things like this, but something strange was out there that night. I don't know what it was, but if you are going to go out into the forest at night, be careful, bring a light and a weapon. In hindsight, we should have just stayed inside and perhaps watched a movie. But when it comes to the unknown, curiosity really does get the better of us sometimes. I've been wanting to write to you and tell you about the most terrifying thing that I've ever experienced in my life. I have no explanation for what I saw, and I'm not normally a believer in those types of things. I read your stories, and I really hope that you can help me. I'll call myself Mike, and if there's ever a time to be proud of being from a small town, this would be it. About 10 years ago now, I was about 21, working for my father in our logging business. We had a lot of work that summer, so we were plenty busy. And this particular night will always stand out in my mind as one of the most confusing, bizarre, and scariest nights I've experienced in my life. I was home sleeping soundly when I get a call about 1 a.m, asking me to come into work early. We had an extra odd amount of trucks coming in on the next shift. They needed somebody there to make sure they got hauled out properly. I woke up, telling my wife I'd be home late and not to wait up. I hopped in my truck and cleared out. It was roughly a 1-hour drive from my house to work, so it took me a little bit of time to get there. Plenty of coffee helped the drive. Once I arrived, pulling around back, everything was going. Everybody was moving stuff around and getting ready. I walked in, and their attention turned towards me immediately when they saw that it was just me. Everybody had been busy, but they all had this look on their faces like something wasn't quite right. Something was unusual. They looked back down at what they were doing again, and I was asked to help park the trucks as they came in. It felt like something weird was going on. I don't know. You could just sense it in the air. I don't know why, but it just had this strange vibe over here in the office that night. You could feel it everywhere around you, which isn't normal, especially for a logging company where everybody knows each other well by now, and there are no secrets or anything weird going on. I don't know what it was, but after seeing how serious everybody looked, I knew it must have been pretty important to get people looking like that at work in the middle of the night. After being told to park some trucks, I went outside and did some of my job. Now, it was roughly 3 a.m. at this point, and I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, when suddenly, this horrible scream shouts off in the distance. And let me just say, it didn't sound like any animal I've ever heard. I can't even begin to explain how strange it sounded. It was very high in pitch and very loud, like a woman screaming but with more force and pitch behind it. I radioed over to my supervisor, who, by the way, is a man that I didn't care for, a man that my father had hired to run the area around here. Anyway, I told him, "Hey, did you hear that? I think somebody is in trouble." But he ignored my response. I got nothing from him. I even tried asking some of my fellow coworkers about it, but they refused to acknowledge it. At this point, something was definitely up. I finished my duty and headed back to the office. Several of us were scared and demanded to know what was going on. I had to sit and wait, but afterwards, my supervisor pulled me aside and explained it to me. Several of the workers on the site in the past couple weeks have all described seeing large humanoid figures just off in the darkness. I laughed and asked if this was some sort of joke. My boss looked extremely concerned. Went on to say that strange screams and noises were also present. And much of the reason I was called into work this early was because of the extra work, because many of the workers are now refusing to show up due to this ongoing phenomenon. Something was going on, and at first, my boss or supervisor refused to acknowledge it, due to not wanting to cycle more fear on the employees. I told him maybe we should just call the police or animal control or something, and then it could be dealt with. He shook his head, explained that the matter is much more complicated than that. I didn't understand what he was talking about. It's like the man was speaking to me in riddles, or if I had a question, he would respond to me with a rhetorical question. Now, it wasn't until about 4:30 that morning that I saw one of these creatures myself. It was watching me, scanning a small woodpile just beyond the reach of light. But the light was faint enough that I could make out what it was. I hate to say it, and it sounds so far-fetched. It even makes my story sound null. This thing looked like a living werewolf in the flesh. It actually reminded me of the movie Dog Soldiers. That's what it looked like. It was tall, and its eyes had this glow to them. I yelled out at it, thinking it was maybe some lunatic playing Halloween. But just before I can get a word out of my mouth, it disappeared. That was enough for me, and I quickly told my supervisor I'm done and I'm going back home. That was fun to explain to the wife, and then later on that day, I had to tell the old man I was quitting the job. Now I work in a completely different field, and I've not seen or dealt with any of these things since. But it easily stands out as one of the scariest things I've ever dealt with. And to this day, I don't know what it was that I saw. I don't want to know, I don't care. I would really prefer this memory to just be forgotten. So my hope is that by writing it out, I can kind of get it out of me. Back when I was about 14 or 15, I used to live in a town which lies on the outskirts of Vancouver Island. Ladysmith, specifically, is known for its mining history and being the home of the first ever trans-Pacific telegraph cable that connected North America to Asia, as well as being heralded for its historical significance. It's also known for one other thing. Alright, so here's what happened. I was out camping in my backyard with some friends, which is basically thick forest, sparsely populated by houses. And during the day, we would just play games or hang out. But at night, we usually hung around a fire till like 2 a.m. Then everybody would go home. This particular night was no different. My friends left, but I stayed by the fire for a bit and decided I was tired enough to go to bed. Once I laid in bed and turned out the lights, that's when it happened. Since I lay with my back facing the window, and I'm laying facing the wall, there was outside light being cast into my window from outside, and I could see this large shadow, this shape approaching my window, which I thought was a person. It approached very fast, and it scared me. I thought somebody was straight up running up to my window. As I turned and reacted to the movement, I just see this giant dog face pressed up against my window, immediately. I nearly passed out from fear. This animal shoved its face so hard up against the window, snot was pouring out. It was the ugliest, scariest looking dog face I've ever seen, and it was looking right down at me. It had this sickly looking snarl. I was terrified. I couldn't even muster a scream. It seemed to know that it really wanted me to at least make some noise. but I was far too afraid. It just started snarling, grimacing, and growling at me through the window for what felt like an hour, staring into my eyes with that ugly face. And then it raised its hands and put them up on the glass. And I mean hands. This thing's hands kind of reminded me of a raccoon's hands. Dark, but individual fingers with claws on them. It would scrape against the glass, trying to push, and if you followed its eyes, it's like it was looking for a weak point, a way to somehow open the window. Then, it would dig its claws into the edges of the window to try and pull the window up. But you could tell it just quite couldn't get it, and it was getting frustrated. Of course, I was terrified. I couldn't get up out of bed. I sat there, completely pale and convinced this was the end. And in such a short amount of time, this creature became aggressive, like it was trying to break its way into my window. And just then, shortly disappeared into the night, with everything staying silent. And there weren't even crickets. The moment it left is when I woke up my parents. And my parents quickly dismissed any notion that this thing was remotely true. They just thought it was vivid night terrors. They suggested some crap like I drink warm milk before bed, or something. I don't even remember. They didn't even look to see the damage that was done to my outside window. They were too concerned with trying to get me back into my room to get some sleep. I never really told anybody about this, until now. I've only recently moved out of that house, but the moment my parents drove off, and we looked outside our window, there were claw marks on the edge of it, where it had tried pulling itself up in. There's no way a dog could have made those marks, unless it was as big as a bear, which is clearly impossible considering the size of dogs. This thing wasn't even regular at all. It was demonic in every sense of the way, and terrified me to the core. I don't feel like I'm the same way after that sighting. I truly believe that this was some sort of demon thing trying to get into my house. God only knows what it would have done. And part of me wonders why it never tried to go back after the back door or through my other window. And also, where did it come from that it would chase right up to my window? Why was I targeted? Why not when I was out there with my friends around the campfire? Had this thing been watching me, waiting for the right moment? So many questions that I still have to this day.